Chapter 1. The Weight of Wounds. Boromir had expected many things in his final moments. He had expected the cold and the way it would seep up through the earth into his back where he lay against the great tree. He had expected the pain, sharp and constant, where the black arrows had found their mark, and the deeper ache that came with knowing he had failed in every way that mattered. He had expected, perhaps, some measure of peace as the life drained out of him, the kind of quiet that came when all debts were finally paid. What he had not expected was to wake up. The first thing that came back to him was Aragorn's voice, low and urgent, speaking words that Boromir could not quite grasp through the fog that seemed to fill his skull. The second thing was the pain, which hadn't lessened, but changed somehow, become sharper and more immediate, as if his body had decided it was not quite ready to surrender after all. The third thing was the realization that he was still breathing, still here, when by all rights he should have been drifting toward whatever judgment awaited the sons of Gondor who had tried to steal hope from hobbits. "Be still," Aragorn was saying, and Boromir felt hands on his chest, pressing against the wounds with a pressure that sent fresh waves of agony through him. "Do not try to speak." But speaking was the only thing that mattered now, the only thing that might make any of this bearable. Boromir's eyes found Aragorn's face, and he saw there a grim concentration that he had seen before in battle, the look of a man fighting odds he could not hope to defeat, but refusing to yield anyway. There was blood on Aragorn's hands, Boromir's blood, and his shirt was torn into makeshift bandages, already stained dark. I tried to take it from him. The words came out as barely a whisper, each one scraping against his throat like gravel. The ring. I tried to take it from Frodo. Aragorn's hands stilled for a moment, and his grey eyes met Boromir's with an expression that was somehow worse than the anger or disgust that Boromir had braced himself for. It was understanding, and pity, and a kind of weary sadness that seemed to go deeper than the immediate crisis of wounds and blood and broken fellowship. "I know," Aragorn said quietly. "You know?" The question came out sharper than Boromir had intended, and he felt a strange, bitter laugh trying to work its way up through his chest. "Then you know what I am, what I have done. I know what the ring does to those who desire to protect what they love," Aragorn replied, his attention returning to the task of keeping Boromir alive. "I know the weight of that desire, and I know that you fought the Uruk-hai until your strength failed, trying to protect Merry and Pippin." The mention of the hobbits sent a bolt of something sharper than physical pain through Boromir's consciousness. He had fought, yes, but not well enough, not quickly enough. The sound of their voices calling for help had followed him into the darkness. And now, where are they? Boromir tried to sit up, ignoring the way the world tilted and blurred at the edges. Merry and Pippin, are they? Gone. Aragorn's voice carried a flatness that struck Boromir like a physical blow. The Uruk-hai took them. Their trail leads toward Isengard. Boromir let his head fall back against the rough bark of the tree, staring up through the branches at a sky that seemed too bright, too ordinary for what had just transpired. He had failed Frodo by trying to take the ring. He had failed Merry and Pippin by being too slow, too weak to prevent their capture. He had failed the Fellowship by forcing its dissolution through his own corruption. He had failed Gondor by abandoning his duty for a quest that had cost everything and gained nothing. The worst part was that he was still alive to know it. "I should be dead," he said, and the words came out with a certainty that surprised him. "I felt it, Aragorn. I felt the life going out of me. I should not be here." "No," Aragorn agreed, and there was something in his tone that made Boromir look at him more carefully. "You should not. Your wounds—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I have seen men die from less. But you are here, and we must deal with what is. Not what should be. What is?" Boromir turned the phrase over in his mind, trying to make sense of it. What was that he had betrayed the trust of the one person who had never looked at him with the calculation and political maneuvering he was used to from the court of Gondor. What was that two young hobbits who had become dear to him were now prisoners of the enemy, facing whatever cruel fate Saruman had devised for them. What was that Frodo and Sam were gone, vanished across the river with the ring and the hope of all free peoples, and that Boromir might never have the chance to beg the forgiveness he knew he did not deserve. "I cannot go back to Minas Tirith," he said, and the realization settled over him with a weight that was somehow heavier than the arrows had been. "Not now. Not after this." Aragorn was quiet for a long moment, his hand still working with practiced efficiency to clean and bind the wounds. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. "What you tried to do does not define what you must do next." "Does it not?" Boromir met his eyes again, searching for any trace of the judgment he felt he deserved. "I am the Captain General of Gondor, the heir to the stewardship. I was supposed to protect the Fellowship, and instead I destroyed it. How does a man come back from that?" "I do not know," Aragorn admitted, and his honesty was somehow more comforting than any reassurance could have been. "But I know that Merry and Pippin are alive, and that they will need all the strength we can muster to save them. I know that Frodo chose his path, and that our choices now will determine whether his sacrifice has any meaning. And I know that you are here against all expectation, and that must be for some purpose." "Purpose?" Boromir closed his eyes, trying to feel anything that might resemble a sense of direction or calling. All he could feel was the pain, both physical and otherwise, and a hollow emptiness where his certainty about his role in the world used to live. He had been the son who would inherit his father's burden, the warrior who would stand between Gondor and her enemies, the man who understood what must be done regardless of the cost. Now he was something else, entirely, something he did not have words for yet. "Can you travel?" Aragorn asked, and Boromir opened his eyes to find the ranger studying him with a clinical assessment that somehow managed to be both impersonal and deeply caring. "The Uruk-hai have hours on us already." The thought of standing, let alone walking or running, seemed impossible. The thought of lying here while Merry and Pippin suffered for his failures seemed worse. Boromir gritted his teeth and began the slow, agonizing process of pushing himself upright, accepting Aragorn's steadying hand without the pride that would once have made him refuse such assistance. "I can travel," he said, though every fiber of his body argued otherwise. "I may not be much use in a fight, but I can travel." "You may be more use than you think," Aragorn replied, helping him to his feet with a gentleness that made Boromir's throat tighten unexpectedly. "You know the ways of war better than any of us, and Merry and Pippin, they will need to see a familiar face when we reach them." "When? Not if." Boromir leaned heavily against the tree, testing his balance and trying to ignore the way the world kept threatening to slide sideways. He thought of the hobbits' faces, young and trusting, and so far from the Shire they had never wanted to leave. He thought of Frodo's expression when he had demanded the ring, the way the hobbit had looked at him with hurt and fear instead of the friendship that had been growing between them through the long miles from Rivendell. He thought of the sound of orc horns in the distance, drawing further away with each passing moment. "Then we go," he said, and took his first step toward whatever redemption might be possible for a man who should be dead, but somehow was not. We go, and we bring them home. Chapter 2. The burden of living Legolas heard the voices before he saw them. Aragorn's steady murmur and another, weaker voice that should not have existed. He and Gimli had followed the sounds of battle to this place, expecting to find either victory or bodies, but not this strange tableau. The ranger kneeling beside a figure, propped against the great tree, both of them alive when all the signs had suggested otherwise. Boromir. Gimli's voice carried a note of something between relief and confusion. We thought, when we found the battlefield. So did I, Boromir replied, and there was a bitter edge to his words that made Legolas study his face more carefully. The man looked like death, pale beneath the grime and blood, but his eyes held a clarity that seemed almost painful in its intensity. It would have been simpler if you had been right. Legolas felt the weight of unspoken knowledge pass between Aragorn and Boromir, something that made the elf's skin prickle with unease. In 3,000 years of life, he had learned to recognize the particular quality of silence that followed betrayal, and it hung in the air between them now, like smoke from a funeral pyre. "Where are Frodo and Sam?" Gimli asked, settling his axe against his shoulder and looking around the trampled ground. "And the little ones?" "Gone," Aragorn said simply. "All of them. Frodo and Sam crossed the river. Merry and Pippin?" He gestured toward the trampled earth, where boot prints and drag marks told their own grim story. The Uruk-hai took them toward Isengard. Legolas crouched beside one of the clearer tracks, reading the story written in mud and broken grass. Many feet, moving fast, and beneath the heavy tread of orcs, the lighter impressions of bare hobbit feet. His jaw tightened as he traced the path with his eyes, noting how the trail led steadily northwest toward Saruman's stronghold and whatever fate the White Wizard had planned for prisoners. "How long?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Hours," Boromir said, attempting to push himself more upright against the tree. The movement sent a tremor through him that he tried and failed to hide. Too many hours. They could be halfway to the gap by now. "Then we follow," Gimli declared, with the straightforward certainty that Legolas had come to associate with dwarven decision-making. 4 can move faster than an army of orcs burdened with prisoners. 4. Legolas looked pointedly at Boromir, taking in the makeshift bandages and the way the man held himself, as if movement might shake him apart. "Can you even stand?" The question came out harsher than he had intended, but the elf found himself struggling with emotions he could not quite name. Relief that Boromir lived warred with frustration at the complications his survival created, and beneath both was a growing sense that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamics between them. The Boromir he had known would have met such a challenge with pride and bluster. This Boromir merely nodded, as if the doubt were justified. "I can stand," he said quietly. "Whether I can keep up is another matter. But I will not ask you to carry me, and I will not slow you down if there is any way to prevent it. You will not slow us down because you will not come with us," Aragorn said, and his tone carried a finality that surprised Legolas. "Your wounds—" "My wounds are my concern." Boromir's voice sharpened, but there was desperation beneath the authority rather than mere stubbornness. "And my responsibility to Merry and Pippin is greater than my responsibility to my own comfort." Legolas found himself studying the man's face, searching for the arrogance and self-regard that had always characterized Boromir's interactions with the Fellowship. What he saw instead was something rawer and more complicated, a kind of anguish that went deeper than physical pain. The elf's unease deepened. Men did not look like that unless they had failed in some fundamental way, and the implications of that failure in this context. "What happened here?" Legolas asked, directing the question to Aragorn but keeping his eyes on Boromir. "Before the orcs came. What happened to break the fellowship?" The silence that followed was answer enough. Legolas saw the way Boromir's hands clenched, the way Aragorn's jaw tightened, and felt the pieces of understanding click into place with the inevitability of a trap closing. The ring. It always came back to the ring, and the way it called to those who believed themselves strong enough to wield it wisely. "I see," he said softly. "Do you?" Boromir met his gaze directly, and Legolas was surprised by the steadiness there. "Do you see that I am the reason 2 innocents are now in the hands of our enemies? Do you see that my corruption destroyed any chance we had of completing this quest as a fellowship? Because if you do not see those things clearly, then you do not see anything at all." The honesty was like a physical blow. Legolas had expected denial, justification, the sort of political maneuvering that men seemed to excel at when caught in their failures. He had not expected this stark acknowledgement of guilt, this willingness to name his own crimes without softening them. It left the elf feeling off balance, uncertain of how to respond. "I see that Merry and Pippin are still alive," Gimli said bluntly, apparently untroubled by the complexities that were tying Legolas in knots. "I see that talking about what cannot be undone will not help them, and I see that we are wasting time we do not have." "Gimli is right," Aragorn said, though his attention remained focused on Boromir. "We must decide. Do we follow Frodo's path, or do we attempt to rescue the hobbits?" Legolas felt the question settle over them like a weight. In the abstract, the choice seemed obvious. The ring was the heart of everything, the one hope of victory against the shadow. 2 lives, however precious, could not be weighed against the fate of all Middle-earth. But looking at Boromir's ravaged face, thinking of Merry's quick smile, and Pippin's infectious laughter, the calculus became more difficult. "Frodo chose his path knowing the risks," Boromir said slowly. "He chose it for Sam as well, and I have no right to second-guess that choice now, not after what I tried to do. But Merry and Pippin did not choose to be taken. They are prisoners because I failed to protect them. That debt is mine to pay." "And if paying it costs Frodo his life?" Aragorn asked quietly. "If our choice here determines whether the ring reaches Mount Doom or falls into enemy hands." Boromir was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on something beyond the immediate circle of their debate. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that seemed to come from some deep place within him. "Then we trust in the same providence that kept me alive when I should have died. We trust that Frodo is stronger than I was, and that his path will lead where it must, regardless of our choices. And we do what honor demands. We protect those who cannot protect themselves, even if the cost is everything else we hold dear." Legolas found himself nodding before he fully realized what he was agreeing to. The logic was flawed, the odds impossible, and the strategic value of rescuing 2 hobbits minimal compared to the importance of supporting the ring-bearer. But there was something in Boromir's words that spoke to truths older than strategy, older than the current war. The obligation to protect the innocent. The debt that failure created. The way redemption sometimes required choosing the harder path rather than the wiser one. "Then we go north," he said, surprising himself with the certainty in his voice. "We follow the Uruk-hai, and we bring them home." Gimli grunted his approval, already checking his weapons and supplies with the efficiency of a warrior preparing for a long chase. Aragorn studied each of them in turn, his grey eyes unreadable, before nodding slowly. "Then we go," he agreed. "But Boromir, if you cannot keep the pace—" "Then you leave me behind," Boromir finished, using the tree to lever himself upright with visible effort. "I understand the terms, but until that moment comes, I ask only that you let me try to earn back what I have lost." Watching him stand, swaying but upright, Legolas felt something shift in his understanding of the man. This was not the Boromir who had argued for taking the ring to Gondor, whose pride and certainty had rankled the elf at every turn. This was someone humbler and more breakable, but perhaps also more genuinely heroic than the man who had fallen to the ring's temptation. It remained to be seen whether that transformation would be enough to sustain him through what was to come. "Then we begin," Aragorn said, shouldering his pack and checking the lie of his sword. "The trail is hours cold already. We have ground to make up." They set off into the growing afternoon, 4 figures moving northwest across the rolling grasslands toward whatever fate awaited them at the end of their pursuit. Behind them, the battlefield at Amon Hen grew smaller and more distant, but its consequences followed them like shadows, changing everything they thought they knew about duty, friendship, and the price of living with the choices they had made. Chapter 3. The hunt across Rohan. The first day nearly killed him. Boromir had thought he understood pain, the clean ache of sword work, the sharp bite of enemy steel, the deep throb of muscles pushed past their limits in defense of the White City. But this was something else entirely, a constant grinding presence that seemed to live in his bones and speak to him with every step. The arrow wounds pulled and burned beneath their bandages, sending fresh jolts through his chest with each breath, and his legs felt as though they might simply fold beneath him at any moment. But he did not stop, and he did not ask them to slow their pace. Aragorn set a punishing rhythm across the grasslands, following sign that only he could read with any certainty. Legolas ranged ahead and to the sides, his keen eyes picking out details that human sight would miss. Gimli kept pace with grim determination, his shorter stride requiring twice the effort, but never faltering, and Boromir simply endured, putting one foot in front of the other because stopping meant abandoning Merry and Pippin to whatever fate Saruman had planned for them. "You're bleeding again," Aragorn observed during one of their brief rests, his gaze fixed on the spreading stain across Boromir's bandages. "I know." Boromir accepted the water skin that Legolas offered, grateful for the momentary reprieve. "It will stop." "Will it?" Gimli's voice carried a note of skepticism that Boromir found he could not argue with. "Or will you bleed yourself to death, trying to prove something that needs no proving?" The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that Boromir was not sure he was ready to examine. What was he trying to prove? That he could be trusted, that his commitment to the hobbit's welfare outweighed his failure at Amon Hen, that the man who had tried to take the ring could still be counted a friend to those he had betrayed. "I am trying," he said finally, "to do what should have been done from the beginning, to put their safety before my own comfort." "Your comfort?" Legolas's eyebrows rose. "Is that what you call 3 arrow wounds and a 2-day chase across open country?" Boromir almost smiled at that, but the expression felt strange on his face, as though his features had forgotten how to arrange themselves for anything but grimness. "I call it penance. Whether it is enough remains to be seen." They rose and resumed their pursuit, the sun climbing higher as they moved northwest across the rolling plains of Rohan. The trail was clear enough, even to Boromir's inexperienced eye. The Uruk-hai had made no attempt to hide their passage, confident in their speed and the distance they had gained. Bootprints and the occasional discarded piece of gear marked their route like a string of breadcrumbs leading toward Isengard, and whatever doom awaited there. The second day brought rain, cold and driving, that soaked through their cloaks and turned the ground beneath their feet into treacherous mud. Boromir's wounds ached worse in the damp, and he found himself struggling not just with exhaustion, but with a fever that made the world waver at the edges of his vision. Still, he pressed on, driven by something that went deeper than duty or even guilt, a desperate need to prove, if only to himself, that he could still be the man he had always believed himself to be. "The track turns north here," Aragorn called back to them, crouching beside a clear set of prints in the muddy earth. "They are making directly for the gap of Rohan now." "How far ahead?" Gimli asked, wiping rain from his beard and squinting at the churned ground. "Half a day, perhaps less." Aragorn's expression was grim. "But there are other tracks here as well. Horses. Many horses, moving fast from the east." Boromir felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the rain. Horses meant riders, and riders in this part of Rohan meant either Rohirrim or enemies of Rohan. Given the direction and the urgency of their passage, he suspected he knew which was more likely. "Eomer," he said, the name coming to his lips without conscious thought. "It will be Eomer and his Eord." The others turned to look at him, and Boromir realized that he had spoken from knowledge they did not share. "The third Marshal of Riddermark," he explained, trying to keep his voice steady, despite the way the fever made his thoughts feel sluggish and disconnected. "He has been patrolling the borders, hunting orc bands. If there are horse tracks here—" He trailed off, not wanting to voice the conclusion that seemed increasingly inevitable. If Eomer had found the Uruk-hai, the battle was already over. And if the battle was over, then Merry and Pippin were either free or dead, with no middle ground between those possibilities. They found the battlefield on the morning of the third day. The slaughter had been complete and efficient, the kind of work that spoke to the skill and fury of the Rohirrim when their blood was up. Bodies lay scattered across the grass, orcs and Uruk-hai alike, their black blood already drawing flies in the warming air. Weapons and armor were strewn about like the debris of a storm, and the smell of death hung heavy over everything. But there were no hobbits among the dead. "Search carefully," Aragorn commanded, though Boromir could see in his face the same desperate hope that was clawing at his own chest. "Look for any sign of them." They spread out across the battlefield, each of them hunting for evidence of the hobbits' fate with the intensity of people whose own souls depended on what they might find. Boromir moved more slowly than the others, his injuries making it difficult to crouch and rise repeatedly, but he searched with the same methodical thoroughness that had served him in the defense of Osgiliath. It was Gimli who found the first sign, a length of elven rope, cut clean through, lying beside one of the Uruk-hai bodies. "Here!" he called, and they converged on the spot like hunters called to a kill. This rope was not cut by orc blade. The cut is too clean, too precise. Legolas knelt beside the rope, running it through his fingers with the reverence due to work of his people. "It was cut from within," he said after a moment, "by someone who knew where to place the blade for maximum effect." "Smart lads," Gimli murmured, and Boromir heard genuine affection in the dwarf's voice, smarter than their captors gave them credit for. Hope flared in Boromir's chest, bright and painful as a physical flame. If the hobbits had managed to free themselves during the battle, if they had escaped into the confusion while the Rohirrim were routing their captors. "There!" Aragorn called from the edge of the battlefield, and Boromir followed his pointing finger to see tracks leading away from the carnage, small, bare footprints, heading toward the dark line of trees that marked the border of Fangorn Forest. They followed the trail to the forest's edge, where the tracks disappeared beneath the shadowed eaves like a path leading into another world entirely. Boromir stared up at the ancient trees, feeling something stir in his memory. Old stories told by his nurses, tales of the shepherds of the trees, and the wrath of growing things when roused to anger. "Fangorn," he said softly, and the name seemed to carry more weight than it should. They went into Fangorn Forest. "Then we follow," Gimli declared, though Boromir noticed the way his knuckles whitened around the handle of his axe. "Do we?" Aragorn's question was quiet, but it stopped them all where they stood. "Do we follow two hobbits into a forest where trees are said to move of their own will, and the very air whispers with older magics than any of us understand?" The question hung between them, and Boromir found himself considering not just the immediate tactical situation, but something deeper and more fundamental. For days now, he had been driven by guilt and the need to atone for his failure. But standing here at the threshold of Fangorn, looking at the evidence that Merry and Pippin had survived their ordeal and chosen their own path to safety, he felt something else stirring in his chest. Pride. Not the selfish pride that had led him to seek the ring, but the quiet satisfaction that came from seeing courage rewarded and intelligence triumph over brute force. The hobbits had saved themselves, had proven once again that there was more strength in the small folk of Middle-earth than most would credit. They had reminded him why the fellowship had been formed in the first place, not to aggrandize any one member, but to protect something precious and irreplaceable. "We follow," he said, and his voice carried a certainty that surprised even him. "Not because they are helpless and need our protection, but because they are our friends, and we do not abandon friends. Not for fear of trees or magic or anything else that might wait in the shadows." He looked at each of his companions in turn, seeing his own resolve reflected in their faces. "I came on this quest, believing that my duty was first to Gondor, then to the Fellowship. I was wrong. The Fellowship, what it represents, what it protects, is larger than any one kingdom or people. These hobbits are part of that. They matter not because of what they can do for us, but because of who they are." Without waiting for a response, Boromir stepped across the threshold and into the green shadows of Fangorn Forest. Behind him, he heard the others follow, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet of leaves and moss that had been accumulating beneath these trees since the world was young. The forest closed around them like a living thing, and Boromir felt the last of his old certainties fall away completely. He was no longer the heir to the stewardship of Gondor, no longer the proud captain who had once believed that strength and will could solve any problem. He was simply a man walking into the unknown, following friends who mattered more than his own comfort or safety or pride. It was, he realized, exactly who he had always been meant to be. Chapter 4. The Voice of Saruman. The old man appeared between the trees like a memory-given substance, white robes gleaming in the dappled light that filtered through Fangorn's ancient canopy. For a moment that stretched into eternity, Boromir felt his mind refuse to accept what his eyes were showing him. The figure was familiar and strange all at once. The face was known, but everything else had changed in ways that spoke of transformation beyond mere healing or rest. "Gandalf?" Aragorn's voice carried the same disbelief that was freezing Boromir's thoughts in place. "Yes," the wizard replied, and even his voice was different, carrying an authority that had been present before but was now impossible to ignore. "That was what they used to call me, Gandalf the Grey. I am Gandalf the White." Legolas dropped to one knee with fluid grace, and after a moment's hesitation, Gimli followed suit. Aragorn inclined his head deeply, recognition and relief warring in his expression. But Boromir found himself unable to move, caught between wonder and a growing sense that the world had shifted around him in ways he was only beginning to understand. "You died," he said, the words emerging as barely more than a whisper. "At the bridge of Khazad-dûm. We saw you fall." Gandalf's eyes, brighter now, like starlight captured in aged features, fixed on him with an intensity that seemed to see straight through to his bones. "Yes," he said simply, "and yet here I am. Death is not always the end of the story, son of Gondor, as you yourself have learned." There was something in the way he said it that made Boromir's skin prickle with unease. Not accusation, exactly, but a kind of knowing that suggested the wizard understood more about recent events than should have been possible. "You know," Boromir said, though it was not quite a question, "about what I tried to do, what I became. I know that you fell to a temptation that has claimed wiser and stronger than you," Gandalf replied, his tone carrying neither judgment nor absolution. "I know that you survived wounds that should have killed you, and that you chose to pursue your friends rather than return to the comfort of your father's halls. I know that you stand here now, humbled but not broken, and that is no small thing." The words should have been reassuring, but they left Boromir feeling more unsettled than before. There was something in Gandalf's manner that suggested purpose behind every event, design where Boromir had seen only chaos and failure. "Part of the design," the wizard murmured, as if reading his thoughts. "Yes, I believe it may be so. Your survival, your choice to follow this path. These things may serve purposes that none of us can yet see clearly." Before Boromir could ask what that might mean, a sound like distant thunder rolled through the forest, followed by voices, familiar voices, raised in what sounded almost like song. Aragorn was already moving toward the sound, and the others followed, winding between the massive trunks until they came upon a sight that made Boromir's heart leap with relief, so sharp it was almost painful. Merry and Pippin sat on the shoulders of something that might once have been a tree, if trees could walk and speak and carry themselves with the dignity of ancient kings. They were dirty and dishevelled, but unmistakably alive and whole, and when they caught sight of the approaching group, their faces lit up with joy that banished the last shadows of Boromir's fears for their safety. "Aragorn! Legolas! Gimli!" Pippin called out, practically bouncing with excitement. "And Boromir! Oh, this is wonderful! Treebeard, these are the friends I told you about." The creature, Ent, Boromir realized, remembering childhood stories that had seemed like pure fantasy until this moment, turned great amber eyes toward them and spoke in a voice like wind through ancient leaves. "So," Treebeard rumbled, "these are the hasty folk who have been hunting through my forest. Yes, I can see the care in their faces. The young ones spoke truly of your friendship." Boromir found himself studying Merry and Pippin with an intensity that bordered on desperate. They looked well, tired perhaps, and marked by their ordeal, but there was something in their bearing that spoke of growth rather than trauma. They had survived capture, escaped their bonds, and found shelter with beings out of legend itself. They had proven themselves in ways that had nothing to do with sword skill or strength of arm. "We feared the worst," he said, when they had climbed down from Treebeard's shoulders and he could embrace them properly. "When we found the battlefield, when we saw what the Rohirrim had done to the Uruk-hai—" "Oh, that was magnificent," Pippin interrupted, his eyes bright with memory. "We were hiding in the woods when they came thundering across the field, and the sound of their horns. I've never heard anything like it, like the music of war itself." The orcs never knew what hit them, Merry added with satisfaction. And we were already free by then, thanks to Pippin's clever fingers with the ropes. Boromir felt something ease in his chest that he hadn't realized was still tight with worry. The hobbits spoke of their escape not as victims recounting trauma, but as participants in their own rescue, proud of their quick thinking and resilience. They had not been broken by what they had endured. If anything, they seemed to have discovered strength they had not known they possessed. "You did well," he said simply, and meant it more deeply than perhaps they could understand. "You survived, and you chose your own path to safety. That took courage." "Courage?" Pippin looked genuinely surprised. "We were terrified the whole time." "Courage is not the absence of fear," Gandalf interjected gently. "It is the mastery of it. And you both showed mastery indeed." The wizard's attention turned to Treebeard then, and there was a conversation in the old tongue that Boromir could not follow, though he caught references to fire and stone and the anger of growing things. When it concluded, Treebeard's expression had grown darker, more terrible, like a storm gathering strength among mountain peaks. "Saruman," the Ent said, and the name emerged like a curse. "The Tree Killer. The Destroyer. Yes, we have much to settle with Saruman, and so they came to Isengard, or what remained of it. The sight that greeted them was beyond anything Boromir could have imagined. Where once had stood Saruman's impregnable fortress, now there was only devastation on a scale that spoke to powers beyond mortal comprehension. The great wall was broken in a dozen places, its stones scattered like children's toys. The machinery of war that had filled the circle was twisted wreckage, buried beneath a lake of dark water that had somehow been brought into being in a matter of hours. And rising from the center of the destruction, Orthanc stood like a lone finger of black stone, unbroken but utterly isolated. "The Ents," Gandalf explained, seeing their astonishment. "And the Huorns, the tree shepherds. When Saruman's fires had burned too much, destroyed too many of the ancient groves, they remembered their strength. They remembered their anger." Boromir stared at the destruction and felt something cold settle in his stomach. This was power, not the kind he had dreamed of wielding through the ring, not the political authority he had inherited by birth, but something older and more terrible, the power of the world itself, to reject those who sought to reshape it according to their own will. "It is a lesson," he said quietly, though he was not sure he intended the words to be heard. "What sort of lesson?" Merry asked, coming to stand beside him at the water's edge. Boromir was quiet for a long moment, watching the dark water lap at the broken stones. "That seeking power over others brings its own destruction. That there are forces in the world that cannot be bent to serve any individual will, no matter how strong or clever or determined that will might be." It was Gandalf who answered, though his attention seemed fixed on the black tower rising from the artificial lake. Saruman believed that strength and cunning could overcome any obstacle. He believed that the old powers, the Ents, the forests, the natural order itself, were weak things that could be brushed aside by superior will and modern methods. He was wrong. As if summoned by their discussion, a voice rang out from the pinnacle of Orthanc, smooth, resonant, compelling. Saruman the White appeared on his balcony, and even at this distance, even knowing what he had become, Boromir felt the pull of that voice as it began to speak. "So, Gandalf, you return to gloat over my defeat? How small that makes you seem. I had expected better from one who calls himself wise." But it was not Gandalf who held Boromir's attention as the exchange unfolded. It was Saruman himself, still proud, still convinced of his own righteousness, even as he stood surrounded by the ruins of his ambition. The wizard spoke of order and necessity, of hard choices and greater good, and every word was a mirror held up to Boromir's own recent thoughts and justifications. "I sought only to bring order to a chaotic world," Saruman declared when Gandalf challenged him, "to prevent the suffering that comes from weak rulers and divided purposes. The ring would have been better served in the hands of one who understood how to use power wisely." The words hit Boromir like physical blows, each one an echo of arguments he had made to himself during those dark moments when the ring's influence had been strongest. He had told himself that he sought the ring for Gondor's sake, for the protection of his people, for the greater good. He had believed that his wisdom and strength made him uniquely suited to wield such power without corruption. Standing here now, listening to Saruman make the same claims from the wreckage of his fortress, Boromir finally understood the full scope of his own delusion. There was no wisdom that could master the ring's corruption, no strength that could bend it to serve any will but its own. There were only choices: to seek power for its own sake, or to reject it in favor of something smaller but truer. "I would have been him," he murmured, so quietly that only Pippin, standing closest, could hear. Given time, given opportunity, I would have become exactly what he became. Pippin looked up at him with those clear hobbit eyes that had always seen more than they should. "But you didn't," he said simply. "That's what matters, isn't it? Not what you might have done, but what you chose to do instead." The confrontation ended with Saruman's expulsion from the White Council and the destruction of his staff, the final severing of the bonds that had once made him a servant of good. But Boromir barely registered these details, lost as he was in the recognition of his own reflection in the fallen wizard's pride and certainty. As they turned to leave the ruins of Isengard behind, Gandalf fell into step beside him, white robes rustling in the evening breeze. "You are troubled," the wizard observed. "I am enlightened," Boromir replied, "which may be the same thing. I see now what I was becoming, what the ring would have made of me given time. I see the end that awaits all who seek to impose their will upon the world through power alone." Gandalf was quiet for several steps before responding. "And what will you choose to do with that sight?" Boromir considered the question as they walked away from the flooded circle where Saruman's ambition had met its end. Behind them, Orthanc rose into the darkening sky like a monument to the futility of pride. Ahead lay Edoras, and whatever role he might play in the battles to come. "I will choose to serve," he said finally. "Not to lead or command or impose my will, but to serve something larger than myself. Something worth protecting rather than something worth conquering." "That," Gandalf said with satisfaction, "is a choice that no power in Middle-earth can corrupt. Remember it in the dark times that are coming. Remember that the strongest among us are often those who choose not to use their strength for their own ends." As the ruined fortress fell behind them, Boromir felt the last pieces of his old certainty finally crumble away. He was no longer the man who had left Rivendell, no longer the heir to the stewardship who had believed that Gondor's needs outweighed all other considerations. He was something smaller, perhaps, but also something cleaner, a man who had seen the face of his own potential corruption and chosen to turn away from it. The choice, he realized, would have to be made again and again, in every moment when power offered itself and had to be refused. But for now, walking beside friends who had forgiven his failures and accepted his transformation, it felt possible to believe that he might be strong enough to keep making it. Chapter 5. The Call of the Horn. The riders from Rohan found them on the road between Isengard and Edoras, their horses lathered with sweat and their faces grim with the weight of urgent news. Boromir recognized the look in their eyes before they spoke a word. It was the expression of men who carried tidings that would change everything, and not for the better. "Lord Aragorn," the lead rider called as he dismounted, his voice carrying the formal courtesy that men used when they were not certain of their welcome. "King Theoden sends word. There are messages from Gondor, urgent messages that require answer." Boromir felt something cold settle in his chest. Messages from Gondor meant word from his father, and urgent news from Denethor in these times could only mean one thing. The war was escalating beyond what anyone had imagined possible. "Speak freely," Aragorn replied, though Boromir caught the way his grey eyes flicked toward him with something that might have been concern or warning. The messenger reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather pouch, sealed with the white tree of Gondor. The sight of it made Boromir's hands tremble with the urge to snatch it away, to break the seal himself, and read whatever desperate plea his father had sent. But he forced himself to remain still, to let Aragorn receive the messages as protocol demanded. He was no longer the heir to the stewardship, travelling in his own right. He was a member of a fellowship, and the dynamics between them had shifted in ways that would have been unthinkable only weeks ago. Aragorn broke the seal with careful deliberation and unfolded the parchment within. As he read, his expression grew increasingly grave, and Boromir felt his patience crack under the weight of not knowing. "What word?" he asked, his voice rougher than he intended. "What has happened?" Aragorn finished reading before looking up, and when their eyes met, Boromir saw something there that made his stomach drop. Not just concern, but the particular kind of sorrow that came from learning that things were even worse than you had feared. "The beacons of Gondor have been lit," Aragorn said quietly. "Minas Tirith calls for aid. The forces of Mordor march on the Pelennor, and Denethor." He paused, glancing down at the parchment again, as if hoping the words might have changed. "Denethor has fallen into despair. The defense of the city falters, not for lack of courage, but for lack of hope." The world seemed to tilt around Boromir, and he felt the ground shift beneath his feet, as if the earth itself were rejecting him. His father, proud, stubborn, unbreakable Denethor, had fallen into despair. The man who had held Gondor together through decades of pressure and loss, who had never shown weakness even in the darkest moments of the war, had finally reached the end of his endurance. "How?" The word came out as barely a whisper. "How has it come to this so quickly?" But even as he asked, Boromir thought he understood. The loss of Osgiliath had been a blow, but not a fatal one. The approach of Mordor's armies was terrifying, but Minas Tirith had withstood sieges before. No, this was something deeper, the kind of despair that came not from external threats, but from the failure of internal certainties. His father had built his hope around the belief that his son would return with aid, with answers, with some means of salvation for their people. Instead, there had been only silence. And now, "He believes me dead," Boromir said, understanding flooding through him with horrible clarity. "The horn. My father gave me the horn of Gondor when I left for Rivendell. If it were found broken—" He turned to Aragorn, his eyes wide with growing horror. "The horn was in my pack when the Uruk-hai attacked. If it was damaged, if pieces of it made their way back to Minas Tirith, it would be taken as proof of your death," Aragorn finished grimly, "and Denethor would lose the last pillar of his hope for Gondor's future." The weight of realization pressed down on Boromir like a physical thing, making it hard to breathe. His survival, which had seemed like providence or accident depending on the moment, had cost his father everything. While he had been learning lessons about humility and fellowship, While he had been discovering the value of service over command, Denethor had been descending into the kind of black despair that could destroy a kingdom. "I have to go back," he said, though the words came out strained and uncertain. "I have to tell him I'm alive, help him rally the defenses. Gondor cannot fall because of my failure to send word." No. The voice that spoke was not Aragorn's, but Gandalf's, and the wizard stepped forward with an expression of deep concern. "You cannot simply return to Minas Tirith as if nothing has changed. Think, Boromir. What has your survival cost? What questions will your return raise?" The truth hit him like a cold wind off the Pelennor. He could not return as the heir to the stewardship, because he was no longer the man who had left Rivendell in search of answers. The breaking of the fellowship, his attempt to take the ring, his choice to pursue Merry and Pippin instead of following his original mission, all of it would have to be explained. And in the explaining, he would have to reveal depths of failure and transformation that might do more harm than good. "You're right," he said slowly, the admission tasting like ashes in his mouth. "I cannot go back alone. Not as I am. Not with this knowledge." "But Gondor still needs aid," Aragorn said, his voice carrying the weight of decision. "And perhaps this is the moment when other paths must be walked." Boromir looked at him sharply, catching something in his tone that spoke of larger implications. "What do you mean?" "I mean that Gondor calls for her king," Aragorn replied, and though his voice was steady, Boromir could see the cost of the words in his expression. "The time for hiding may be at an end. If Denethor has truly fallen into despair, if the defenses falter for lack of hope, then perhaps what is needed is not the return of the lost heir, but the arrival of the rightful ruler." The silence that followed was profound, weighted with implications that none of them had been ready to face. Boromir stared at Aragorn. At Elessar, he corrected himself, and felt the last pieces of his old understanding of the world rearrange themselves into new patterns. "You would claim the throne," he said, and it was not quite a question. "You would come to Minas Tirith not as a ranger offering aid, but as Isildur's heir demanding recognition." "I would come as a king offering to lead his people in their darkest hour," Aragorn corrected gently. "The question is whether you would stand beside me, or whether that would be too much to ask." Boromir felt the choice open before him like a chasm. He could return to Gondor independently, rally to his father's side, and try to restore Denethor's faith through his mere survival. It would be simpler, cleaner, and it would preserve the old order that had defined his understanding of duty and loyalty for his entire life. Or he could follow Aragorn to Minas Tirith, stand beside him as he claimed the throne that was his by right, and help ease the transition from the old order to the new. It would be more complex, fraught with political dangers and personal humiliations. It would require him to publicly acknowledge Aragorn's authority over his own, to support a claim that would end his family's centuries-long stewardship. But it would also be right. He had learned that much in his weeks of transformation. There was a difference between what was comfortable and familiar and what was actually just. Aragorn was the rightful king, and if Gondor needed hope more than tradition, then her king should come to her in her hour of need. "I will ride with you," he said, the words emerging with a certainty that surprised him. "Not as the heir to the stewardship returning home, but as a friend and counselor to the king. My father may not understand at first, but perhaps he will in time." "It will not be easy," Gandalf warned, "for either of you. The questions of succession, of authority, of legitimacy, these are not matters that can be resolved simply through good intentions and noble hearts." "No," Boromir agreed, But they are matters that must be faced. Gondor calls for aid, and if we can provide it, then the complexities of politics seem secondary to the necessity of survival. He looked around at the others, at Legolas and Gimli, who had watched this exchange with the careful attention of those who understood that momentous decisions were being made, at Merry and Pippin, who looked confused but supportive, at Gandalf, whose ancient eyes seemed to see patterns and purposes that remained invisible to mortal sight. "We will split here," Aragorn decided. "Legolas, Gimli and I will ride hard for Minas Tirith, taking what forces we can gather along the way. Boromir will come with us to help explain the situation and ease whatever difficulties my arrival might create. Gandalf, perhaps you could take Merry and Pippin to Edoras, see to King Theoden's healing, and bring the Rohirrim when they are able to ride." "A sound plan," Gandalf agreed, though his attention remained fixed on Boromir. "But are you certain of this choice, son of Gondor? Once you ride beside Aragorn to the gates of Minas Tirith, there will be no going back to the way things were." Boromir was quiet for a long moment, thinking of his father's face, of the weight of tradition and expectation that had shaped his entire life, of the comfortable certainties he was choosing to abandon. When he spoke, his voice carried a peace that he hadn't felt in months. "There is no going back anyway," he said simply. "I am not the man who left Rivendell, and Gondor is not the kingdom I left behind. We have all been changed by what has happened, and the only choice is whether we will change for the better or for the worse. I choose to trust in the better." As they prepared to part ways, as horses were readied and supplies distributed and farewells were spoken, Boromir felt the weight of the future settling on his shoulders. He was riding toward a confrontation that would test everything he had learned about duty and loyalty and sacrifice. He was choosing to support a claim that would end his family's ancient role and transform his own identity in ways he could not fully predict. But he was not riding alone. He was riding beside friends who had forgiven his failures and accepted his transformation, toward a city that needed hope more than tradition, in service of something larger than his own comfort or pride. It was, he thought, as they set off toward the south and east, exactly what he was meant to do. Chapter 6. The Paths of the Dead. The Dimholt lay before them like a wound in the earth, dark and forbidding even under the pale light of the afternoon sun. Boromir had faced many things in his years as a warrior of Gondor, orcs and Southrons, and the wild men of the hills, but he had never felt the particular kind of dread that seemed to emanate from this place, like cold breath from a tomb. "Are you certain this is necessary?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. They had discussed it at length during their hard ride south from Isengard, weighing the desperate need for reinforcements against the risks of taking a path that few mortals had ever walked and returned to tell of it. "The paths of the dead are the only way to reach those who can aid us in time," Aragorn replied, his voice steady despite the shadows that had gathered in his eyes as they approached this threshold. "The dead have been waiting for 3,000 years to fulfill their oath. If they will answer the call of Isildur's heir, then we will have allies that no force of Mordor can stand against." If. The word hung in the air between them, weighted with implications that made Boromir's stomach clench with unease. If the dead recognized Aragorn's claim, if they chose to honor their ancient oath rather than drag the living down into whatever darkness they inhabited. If Aragorn truly possessed the authority he believed was his by right of blood and birthright. Boromir had spent his entire life dealing with certainties, the strength of steel, the loyalty of soldiers, the weight of stone walls that could withstand siege engines and battering rams, The supernatural was something from children's stories and old songs, not something that intruded on the practical business of warfare and governance. But here they were, preparing to stake everything on the response of oath-breaking spirits to a king who had never worn a crown. "I do not like this," he said quietly, aware that his words carried more weight than mere tactical concern. "I have fought beside you, seen your courage and wisdom, but this is something beyond the realm of ordinary kingship." Legolas, who had been silent through most of their approach, turned to study Boromir's face with those keen, elvish eyes that seemed to see deeper than was comfortable. "You fear the dead?" he observed. And there was no judgment in his voice, only recognition. "Yes," Boromir admitted, finding that honesty came easier now than it once had. "I fear what I cannot understand or control. I fear magic and the supernatural, and anything that operates according to laws I haven't learned. It is a weakness in a warrior. But it is the truth." "It is not weakness," Gimli said gruffly, adjusting his grip on his axe with the nervous energy of a dwarf contemplating ventures into places that were fundamentally opposed to the solid, dependable world of stone and metal. "It is sense. The dead should stay dead. When they do not, it means the natural order has been disturbed in ways that bode ill for the living." But Aragorn was already moving toward the dark opening in the hillside, and after a moment's hesitation, the others followed. The path beyond the threshold sloped downward into blackness so complete that even their torches seemed to struggle against it, casting wavering pools of light that revealed only enough to make the shadows seem more threatening. As they descended, Boromir felt the weight of ages pressing down on him, a sense of accumulated time and sorrow that made it difficult to breathe. The air grew cold, then colder still, until their breath misted before their faces and frost began to form on the stone walls around them. And beneath it all was a sound that might have been wind, or might have been whispering, or might have been the accumulated sighs of the long dead. "They know we are here," Aragorn said, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "They have known since we set foot on the threshold. They are deciding whether to answer, or whether to add our bones to those that already litter these paths." The words did nothing to ease Boromir's growing sense of wrongness, of having stepped outside the world he understood into something older and more dangerous than mortal men were meant to encounter. But he forced himself to continue, one foot after another, because the alternative was abandoning Aragorn to face this trial alone. They reached the heart of the Dimholt, as the last light of day was fading in the world above. The cavern that opened before them was vast beyond the reach of their torchlight, filled with a phosphorescent glow that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. And in that eerie light, shapes began to move. The dead came like mist given form, translucent figures that retained the suggestion of the men they had once been. Warriors in ancient armor, carrying weapons that had long since turned to dust in the upper world. Their faces were terrible, not for any monstrous feature, but for the hopelessness written in every line, the weight of centuries spent neither living nor properly dead. Boromir's hand went instinctively to his sword, though he knew that steel would be useless here. Every instinct he possessed screamed at him to flee, to put distance between himself and these things that should not exist. But he held his ground, watching as Aragorn stepped forward to face the greatest gathering of the dead that had manifested in the cavern's center. "Who dares to disturb the sleepless dead?" The voice that spoke seemed to come from all the gathered spirits at once, a chorus of despair that made Boromir's bones ache with cold. "Who would summon us from our long misery?" "I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, Isildur's heir," Aragorn replied, and something in his voice had changed. Gone was the quiet ranger who had tracked orcs across the plains of Rohan. In his place stood someone who commanded not through force of personality, but through the weight of inherited authority. I call upon you to fulfill the oath you swore to my forefather. The oath? The dead stirred like wind through dry leaves, and their voices carried centuries of bitterness. What do the living know of oaths? What do they know of betrayal and the price of broken faith? I know that you were given the chance to stand with Gil-galad and Elendil at the Dagorlad, Aragorn said, his voice cutting through their lamentations like a blade through mist. I know that you chose instead to flee to your mountain halls, believing that distance could preserve you from the consequences of your choice. I know that Isildur cursed you for your betrayal, and that curse has held you here for 3,000 years. The words fell into the cavern like stones into deep water, and Boromir watched in fascination as the dead recoiled from them, not from the accusation that they seemed to accept, but from the authority with which it was delivered. These were spirits who had defied kings and suffered the consequences, and yet something in Aragorn's bearing compelled their attention in a way that spoke to recognition deeper than conscious thought. And if we were to answer this summons, the voice of the dead asked, after a long moment, if we were to fight as we should have fought long ago, what then? Then your oath would be fulfilled, and you would find the peace that has been denied you, Aragorn replied. Serve truly this time, and the curse of Isildur will be lifted. Your souls will find the rest they have sought for millennia. Boromir felt something fundamental shift in his understanding as he watched what happened next. The dead did not deliberate or argue or demand proof of Aragorn's identity. They simply knew. Something in his bearing, something in the way he carried the weight of kingship, even here in the depths of the earth, convinced them of what he was. We will serve, the voice said, and now it carried not despair, but something that might have been hope. We who fled from the Dagorlad will stand with Isildur's heir at the fields of Pelennor. We who broke faith will help you defend what we once abandoned. Lead us, King of Gondor, and we will follow. King of Gondor. The title echoed in the cavern like a bell, and Boromir felt it settle into his consciousness with the weight of revelation. Not heir, not claimant, not pretender. King. Recognized not just by the living, but by the dead. Not just by those who hoped for salvation, but by those who had learned the true cost of betrayal and broken oaths. As they made their way back to the surface, followed now by an army of spirits that moved through stone as easily as air, Boromir found himself struggling to process what he had witnessed. He had seen Aragorn demonstrate authority that went beyond military command or political maneuvering. He had seen the supernatural world acknowledge claims that no mortal court could validate. He had seen kingship proven not through documents or genealogies, but through something deeper and more primal. You are troubled, Aragorn observed as they emerged from the dim holt into the star-filled night. I am enlightened, Boromir replied, echoing words he had spoken to Gandalf days earlier in a different context. I have spent my life believing that legitimacy came from tradition, that authority was inherited through bloodlines and validated by ceremony. But what I saw down there... He trailed off, trying to find words for something that existed beyond the political frameworks he had always relied upon. They recognized you, he said finally. Not because of any proof you offered, not because of arguments or evidence, but because of what you are. That is not the kind of kingship I was raised to understand. It is not the kind of kingship Gondor has known for 1,000 years, Aragorn agreed. The stewards have ruled with wisdom and honor, maintaining order and defending the realm without the authority that comes from the throne itself. But now, with the darkness rising and the old oaths being called to account, perhaps it is time for a different kind of rule. Boromir was quiet for a long time, walking beside the man who had just commanded the loyalty of the dead through nothing more than the fact of his birthright. When he spoke again, his voice carried a certainty that surprised him. "My father will not understand at first," he said. "The stewards have been the true rulers of Gondor for so long that he may see your return as usurpation rather than restoration. But after tonight, after seeing what I have seen, I will stand with you. Not from duty or friendship, but because you are the rightful king, and Gondor needs her king more than she needs the continuation of familiar traditions. That cannot be an easy choice for the son of a steward to make," Legolas observed quietly. Boromir considered the elf's words as they continued their march toward the distant lights of Minas Tirith, the dead flowing around them like a river of starlight and shadow. It was not an easy choice, but it was a clear one. He had seen too much, learned too much, to pretend that the old certainties still applied. "No," he agreed, "but it is the right choice, and I have learned, perhaps too late but not too late to matter, that doing what is right is more important than doing what is easy." Behind them, the paths of the dead lay empty for the first time in 3 millennia, their long guardians finally free to fulfill the purpose that had eluded them for so long. Ahead lay Minas Tirith, and whatever confrontation awaited when the rightful king arrived to claim his throne. But for now, Boromir walked beside his king through the night, no longer struggling with questions of loyalty or legitimacy. The dead had spoken, and in their recognition, he had found his answer. Chapter 7. The Prince and the Steward's Son. The sight of Minas Tirith rising from the Pelennor fields should have filled Boromir with the fierce joy of homecoming. But instead, he felt only a growing knot of dread in his stomach. The white walls gleamed in the morning light, as proud and defiant as ever, but the banners that flew from the ramparts spoke of siege and desperation. The great gates were barred, the outer defences manned with the urgency of a city under immediate threat. And somewhere within those walls his father waited, believing his eldest son dead, falling deeper into the despair that had already begun to undermine Gondor's defence. "It is beautiful," Aragorn said quietly, drawing his horse up beside Boromir's as they crested the final ridge. "More beautiful than I remembered from my younger days." Boromir glanced at him, noting the way Aragorn's grey eyes fixed on the citadel, with an expression that was part longing, part determination, and part something that might have been fear. Behind them, invisible to mortal sight but nonetheless present, the dead marched in silent ranks toward whatever final battle would release them from their ancient curse. "It is home," Boromir replied, though the word felt strange in his mouth now. He was returning not as the triumphant heir bearing aid for his father, but as the companion of a king who would reshape everything Denethor understood about power and legitimacy in Gondor. Though I suspect it will feel less so before this day is done. They rode toward the gates under a herald's banner, Legolas and Gimli flanking them with the easy competence of warriors who had fought together long enough to read each other's movements without thought. The guards who challenged them at the outer defences wore the look of men who had been under siege pressure for days, their faces drawn with exhaustion and the particular strain that came from knowing the enemy was stronger than they were. "I am Boromir, son of Denethor, returned from the quest to Rivendell," Boromir called to the captain who emerged from the gatehouse. "I bring with me allies in Gondor's hour of need." The effect of his words was immediate and dramatic. The captain's face went white, then flushed with relief and confusion in equal measure. Behind him, Boromir could hear the rapid exchange of voices as word spread through the ranks. The son of the steward lived. He had returned. The reports of his death had been wrong. "My lord!" The captain's voice cracked with emotion. "We thought the horn, broken and blooded, returned to us by the Rohirrim. We thought you were dead. Your father, he has been—" The man struggled for words that could adequately convey what Denethor had become in his grief. "I know," Boromir said gently. "Is he well? Can he receive visitors?" "He can, my lord, though I must warn you, he is not as you left him. The reports of your death, the pressure of the siege, the darkness that has settled over everything. He speaks of endings, my lord, of the last days of Gondor and the futility of resistance." The words hit Boromir like physical blows, each one a reminder of the cost his absence had extracted from the man who had raised him to be Gondor's shield. But before he could respond, the captain's attention shifted to Aragorn, and his expression grew wary. "And your companion, my lord? He has the look of the Dunedain about him." This was the moment Boromir had been dreading since they set out from Isengard. The moment when theory became practice, when the philosophical acceptance of Aragorn's kingship had to translate into political reality. He took a breath, steadying himself for the first of what would undoubtedly be many such conversations. "This is Aragorn, son of Arathorn," he said, his voice carrying across the assembled guards. "Called Strider in the Wild, but known to his people by another name. He is Isildur's heir, the rightful king of Gondor and Arnor, come to aid his city in her darkest hour." The silence that followed was profound, weighted with implications that every man present understood, even if they could not immediately accept them. Boromir saw doubt and disbelief warring with hope in their faces, saw the way their eyes moved from Aragorn's travel-stained cloak to the sword at his side, searching for signs of the royalty that had been proclaimed. "The king," the captain said slowly, as if testing the words. "You claim this man is the king?" "I do not claim it," Boromir replied firmly. "I have seen proof that would convince the most skeptical heart. He is what he says he is, and Gondor has need of her king." The gates opened for them, though Boromir could feel the weight of watching eyes as they rode through the streets toward the citadel. Word of their arrival spread like wildfire. The son of the steward returned from the dead, accompanied by a man who claimed the throne. By the time they reached the court of the fountain, a crowd had gathered, their faces reflecting the same mixture of hope and uncertainty that Boromir had seen in the guards. Denethor was waiting for them in the throne room, and the sight of him struck Boromir like a sword through the heart. His father had aged years in the months since his departure, his hair gone grey, his face carved with lines of grief and despair that had not been there before. The steward's robes hung on him as if he had lost weight, and his eyes held a hollow quality that spoke of a man who had looked too long into darkness. But when those eyes fell on Boromir, they came alive with an emotion so fierce it was almost painful to witness. "My son," Denethor said, and his voice broke on the words. "My son, returned to me from the shadow of death." The embrace that followed was desperate, clinging, and Boromir felt his father's shoulders shake with the release of grief that had been held too long. For a moment, nothing else mattered. Not the political complications of his return. Not the man who stood waiting to be acknowledged as king. Not the armies of Mordor gathering on the fields below. There was only the relief of a father who had mourned a son and found him alive after all. "I thought you were lost," Denethor whispered, his hands gripping Boromir's shoulders as if he might vanish again, if released. The horn, broken in 3 pieces, stained with blood. I thought I had sent you to your death for the sake of a fool's errand. No, father, Boromir said gently. I live, and I have learned much. More than I expected when I left for Rivendell. More than I was prepared to understand. It was then that Denethor's attention shifted to Aragorn, and Boromir watched his father's expression change from joy to wariness, to something approaching hostility. The steward's gaze moved over the ranger with the calculating assessment of a man who had spent decades navigating the political currents of Gondor. "And who is this that my son brings before the throne of the stewards?" Denethor asked, his voice taking on the formal cadence of official business. What manner of man claims escort from the heir of Gondor? Boromir felt his stomach clench with anticipation. This was the moment that would define everything that followed, the point at which years of family loyalty and political tradition would collide with his new understanding of legitimacy and rightful rule. "Father," he said carefully, "this is Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur and rightful king of Gondor. He has come to aid the city in her need, and to claim the throne that is his by right." The silence that followed was deafening. Denethor's face went through a series of expressions: surprise, disbelief, calculation, and finally a cold anger that made Boromir's blood run cold. "King?" Denethor's voice was dangerously quiet. "You bring a pretender before me, and call him king? You, who are heir to the stewardship, who have been raised to understand Gondor's true governance?" "I bring no pretender," Boromir replied, fighting to keep his voice steady. "I have seen proof of his heritage, witnessed his authority, acknowledged by powers greater than any mortal court. He is what he claims to be." "Is he?" Denethor stepped forward, his attention now fully focused on Aragorn, who had remained silent through this exchange. "You claim the throne of Gondor, stranger. By what right do you make such a claim, after centuries of absence? By what authority do you presume to displace the line that has kept this realm safe while your ancestors wandered in the wild?" Aragorn met the steward's gaze steadily, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet dignity that Boromir had learned to recognize as one of his truest qualities. "I claim no right that is not already mine," he said. "I seek to displace no one who has served with honor. The stewards have been the salvation of Gondor, and I hope to work with them, not against them. But the throne stands empty, and in this dark hour, perhaps the city has need of a king." "The throne stands empty, because that is how it should be," Denethor replied sharply. "The stewards rule by right of service, not birth. We have earned our authority through deeds, not ancient bloodlines that may or may not be what they claim to be." Boromir could see the confrontation spiraling toward open conflict, could feel the weight of choice pressing down on him like a physical thing. His father, proud, stubborn, devoted to Gondor's welfare as he understood it, and the man he had come to recognize as the rightful king, faced each other across a gap that seemed to widen with every word spoken. "Father," he said, stepping forward despite the way both men's attention fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity. "I understand your doubts. I shared them once. But I have seen things that changed my understanding of kingship and legitimacy. This man has proven himself in ways that go beyond documents or bloodlines." "Has he?" Denethor's gaze turned on his son with an expression of profound disappointment. "And what has he done to earn such loyalty from the heir of Gondor? What proof has he offered that outweighs the service of 26 stewards?" Boromir thought of the paths of the dead, of the ancient spirits acknowledging Aragorn's authority without question or debate. He thought of Gandalf's assessment that his survival was part of some larger design, of the way the Fellowship had looked to Aragorn for leadership, not because he demanded it, but because it was simply and naturally his. "He has commanded the loyalty of the dead," he said quietly. "He has been acknowledged by powers older than Gondor herself. He has proven himself in battle and counsel, in wisdom and sacrifice, and he has shown me that true kingship is not about taking power, but about accepting responsibility." The words hung in the air between them, and Boromir saw his father's face harden with something that might have been betrayal. The silence stretched until it became almost unbearable, broken finally by Denethor's voice, cold and formal. "I see that my son has been influenced by his travels," the steward said. "Perhaps the grief of believing yourself dead has clouded your judgment, Boromir. Perhaps the strain of your ordeals has made you vulnerable to false promises and borrowed authority." The words stung, not just because of their dismissive tone, but because Boromir could hear the genuine pain beneath them. His father was not just rejecting Aragorn's claim. He was rejecting the transformation that Boromir had undergone, the growth that had cost him so much, but taught him even more. "My judgment has never been clearer," Boromir replied, his voice carrying a conviction that surprised even him. "I have seen what pride and the desire for power can do to good men. I have learned the difference between serving one's own vision of good and serving something larger than oneself. And I have come to understand that Gondor's greatest need is not for familiar traditions, but for righteous leadership, wherever it may come from." Denethor stared at his son for a long moment, and Boromir could see the recognition dawning in his eyes, the realization that the man who had returned was not the same one who had departed for Rivendell. The steward's shoulders seemed to sag under the weight of this new loss, the discovery that his son's survival came at the cost of his loyalty. "Then we have nothing more to discuss," Denethor said finally. "You have made your choice, and I have made mine. The city is under siege, and politics must wait for survival. But do not think that acknowledging this man's presence means acknowledging his claim. The stewardship endures, and will endure, regardless of what ancient ghosts may whisper in the darkness." As they left the throne room, Boromir felt the weight of what had just transpired settling over him like a shroud. He had chosen loyalty to what he believed was right over loyalty to what was familiar and comfortable. He had stood beside his king, even when it meant standing against his father. But the cost of that choice was only beginning to become clear, and he suspected that the hardest trials still lay ahead. Chapter 8. The Battle of the Pelennor Fields. Dawn came grey and bloody to the Pelennor Fields, and with it came the full fury of Mordor's assault on Minas Tirith. From the ramparts of the First Circle, Boromir watched the vast army spread across the plain like a dark tide, their banners snapping in the wind that carried the stench of death and corruption from the east. Orcs and Southrons, trolls and fell beasts, Warmumakil and siege towers, all the strength that the enemy could muster had come to break the last free city of Gondor. But Boromir felt no despair as he looked out over that terrible host. Instead, something long dormant was stirring in his chest, the fierce joy of a warrior who had found his purpose again, who stood in the right place at the right time with a sword in his hand and friends beside him. He had been absent from Gondor's battles for too long, had spent too many months learning hard lessons about humility and service. Now, finally, he could be what he had been trained to be since childhood, a shield for his people, a blade in defense of the light. The walls will not hold, Aragorn said quietly, joining him at the battlements. Not against that. He gestured toward the great catapults that were already hurling stones and worse things at the outer defenses. We must be ready to meet them in the field. Boromir nodded, his attention fixed on the tactical situation unfolding below. Years of military training and experience were asserting themselves, overriding the political uncertainties of the past day. Whatever complications existed between him and Aragorn, whatever tensions remained between the steward and the would-be king, none of that mattered now. What mattered was the defense of Minas Tirith, and that was something he understood with perfect clarity. The main assault will come from the north, he observed, noting the concentration of forces and siege engines. But they will probe our flanks as well, try to stretch our defenses thin. We cannot hold the entire circuit of the outer wall with the men we have. Then we fall back by stages, Aragorn agreed. Make them pay for every yard, but do not let them trap us against walls that cannot be held. It was then that a horn sounded from the gatehouse, clear and proud, and Boromir felt his heart leap with recognition. Not the great horn of Gondor, that lay broken, its pieces returned to his father as proof of his supposed death, but the smaller horn that had been given to him as a boy, that he had carried through all his campaigns. Prince Imrahil had found it in his gear and returned it to him, and now its voice rang out across the Pelennor like a promise of hope restored. The effect on the defenders was immediate and electric. Men who had been preparing for what they believed was their last battle suddenly straightened, their faces transforming as they heard that familiar call and realized what it meant. Boromir, son of Denethor, lived. The heir of the stewards had returned to lead them in their darkest hour. "For Gondor!" Boromir shouted, raising his sword so that its blade caught the grey light of dawn. "For the White City and all that we hold dear." The answering roar that rose from the walls was deafening, a sound of defiance that seemed to shake the very stones of Minas Tirith. Boromir felt it wash over him like a physical force, carrying with it all the love and loyalty that his people had invested in his name, in his family's long stewardship of their realm. For a moment, just a moment, the political complications fell away, and there was only this. A captain returned to his soldiers, a son of Gondor standing with his people against the darkness. But even as the cheer faded, Boromir was aware of the way some of the men looked past him to where Aragorn stood, their expressions mixing hope with uncertainty. They had heard the claims, knew that questions of succession and legitimacy hung over everything like storm clouds. Their loyalty was real, but it was also divided, and that division would have consequences before this day was through. The assault began with the thunder of drums and the shriek of fell voices raised in hatred. Orc ladders struck the walls, grappling hooks found purchase in the stone, and the first wave of attackers came swarming up toward the battlements. But the defenders were ready for them, and led by Boromir and Aragorn fighting side by side, they met the assault with steel and fire. Boromir had forgotten the pure, deadly poetry of battle, the way time seemed to slow and sharpen until every movement became precise and necessary. His sword found its mark again and again, cutting down orcs that sought to gain the wall, while beside him Aragorn wielded Andúril with the skill of a master swordsman. They moved together as if they had been fighting as partners for years, anticipating each other's needs, covering each other's backs, creating between them a zone of death that no enemy could penetrate. "The South Gate," Aragorn called out during a brief lull in the fighting. "They are bringing up a ram." Boromir looked where he pointed and saw the great siege engine grinding toward the gates of the first circle, pulled by trolls and protected by a wedge of Sothan warriors. It was a massive thing, carved with evil runes and wreathed in dark fire, and he knew with the certainty of long experience that no gates would stand against it. "I will take a company and harry their flanks," he said, already moving toward the stairs that led down from the wall. "If we can disrupt their formation—" "No," Aragorn caught his arm. "Too dangerous. We need you here, commanding the defense." For a moment, Boromir felt the old pride stir, the automatic resistance to being told what he could or couldn't do by anyone, even someone he had acknowledged as king. But then he looked at Aragorn's face and saw not the desire to control, but genuine concern, the worry of a friend and ally who could not bear to lose someone he had come to value. "You are right," he said, and the admission came easier than it once would have. "I will coordinate from here, but someone must lead that sally, or the gates will fall within the hour." "I will go," Aragorn said. But before either of them could move, a new sound reached them, the deep, resonant call of a horn from the north, followed by another and another, until the very air seemed to vibrate with their music. "Rohan," Boromir breathed, and felt hope flare in his chest like a beacon lit on a mountain top. "Rohan has come." They appeared on the northern horizon, like something out of legend. 6,000 horses, bearing the finest cavalry in Middle-earth, their lances bright in the growing light, their banners streaming in the wind. At their head rode Theoden King, no longer the broken old man who had been bespelled by Saruman, but the warrior lord of ancient songs, his sword naked in his hand, and death riding with him. The charge of the Rohirrim struck the Orc host like a thunderbolt, scattering their northern flank and driving deep into their ranks. But even as Boromir watched that glorious assault, he could see that it would not be enough. The Orcs were too many, their formation too deep, and already they were beginning to regroup and respond. "We must sally forth," he said urgently. "Hit them while they are still reeling from the charge." "Agreed," Aragorn replied. "I will take the men of the south and—" "My Lord Boromir!" The voice belonged to Captain Beregond, one of the guard of the citadel, who had appeared at Boromir's elbow with a look of desperate urgency. "The men are asking for orders. Some say we should follow you in a sally against the enemy. Others say we should wait for the king's command. They do not know who to obey." And there it was, the complication that Boromir had been dreading. In the heat of battle, with lives hanging in the balance, the question of authority could not be avoided or deferred. The men knew him, had served under him before, trusted his judgment in matters of war. But they also knew that Aragorn claimed the throne, had heard Boromir himself acknowledge that claim. The result was confusion at exactly the moment when clarity was most needed. Boromir looked at Aragorn and saw his own understanding reflected in the other man's grey eyes. They could not command effectively while the question of succession remained unresolved. Someone had to give way, at least for the duration of the battle. "Captain Beregond," Boromir said, his voice carrying across the assembled soldiers with the authority of a lifetime's command. "You will take your orders from King Elessar." He turned to Aragorn, his expression grave but resolute. "I serve the rightful king of Gondor, and in this hour of need, his word is law." Aragorn met his gaze for a long moment, and Boromir saw something pass through his expression. Gratitude, perhaps, or recognition of the cost such a public declaration entailed. Then he turned to address the soldiers, his voice taking on the tone of command. "Men of Gondor," he called, "your captain speaks truly. I am Aragorn, son of Arathorn, heir of Isildur, and I call upon you to follow me in defense of your city. Lord Boromir will serve as my lieutenant in this battle, and his counsel will guide our strategy. Together, we will drive back this darkness." The response was immediate, if not entirely uniform. Most of the soldiers shouted their acceptance, caught up in the moment and the promise of coordinated resistance. But Boromir noted the way some faces remained troubled, the way certain groups of men looked to their immediate officers rather than to either of the competing commanders. The political complications would have to be sorted out later. For now, there was a battle to fight. The sally that followed was a thing of terrible beauty, a coordinated assault that struck the enemy just as they were trying to respond to the Rohirrim's charge. Boromir led the van, his sword blazing in the morning light, while Aragorn commanded the centre, and Prince Imrahil brought up the rear with the knights of Dol Amroth. They struck the orc lines like a spear thrust, driving deep into the enemy formation and sowing chaos in their ranks. For a time, it seemed as though valor and skill might triumph over sheer numbers. The men of Gondor fought with the fury of those defending their homes, while the Rohirrim continued their devastating charges across the northern reaches of the field. Enemy formations broke and scattered. Their commanders fell to well-placed arrows and sudden cavalry strikes, and for a brief, shining moment, victory seemed possible. But then the Mumakil came. The great war elephants of the south crashed into the battle like moving fortresses, their tusks gleaming with steel caps, their backs bristling with archers and spearmen. The horses of Rohan shied away from their alien scent and terrible trumpeting, and even the disciplined infantry of Gondor gave ground before their charge. Boromir found himself separated from Aragorn in the chaos, leading a desperate defense against one of the beasts that had broken through their lines. His sword was useless against its hide, his men scattered like leaves before its fury. But then he remembered lessons learned in childhood, tales of the great battles of the past, and he began to coordinate a different kind of response. "The legs!" he shouted to his men. "Hamstring the beast! Bring it down!" It was dangerous work, requiring men to get close to the thrashing limbs and exposed bellies of the Mumakil. But it was also effective, and one by one the great beasts began to fall, their riders spilled onto the field to be dealt with by conventional weapons. When the horn calls finally sounded the retreat back to the city's defences, Boromir realized with something approaching amazement that they had held. The assault had been turned back, the enemy forces scattered and demoralized, and Minas Tirith still stood unconquered. Around him, men were cheering and embracing, their faces bright with the fierce joy of warriors who had faced death and emerged victorious. "Well fought," Aragorn said, appearing at his side with a smile that transformed his usually grave features. "Your tactics with the Mumakil, where did you learn such things?" "From my grandfather's journals," Boromir replied, wiping orc blood from his blade before sheathing it. He fought against the Haradrim in the wars of his youth, learned that even the greatest beast has weak points, if you know where to look for them. It was only then, in the aftermath of victory, that Boromir became aware of the way certain groups of soldiers were looking at him, not with the simple loyalty of men toward their captain, but with something more complex and potentially troubling. He had commanded well in the battle, had proven his tactical skills and personal courage beyond question. But in doing so, he had also demonstrated why the question of succession was so difficult to resolve. Aragorn might be the rightful king, acknowledged by ancient powers and supernatural forces. But Boromir was the captain these men knew and trusted, the heir of the stewards who had led them to victory in their darkest hour. And as they looked between the two of them, Boromir could see the questions forming in their minds, questions that would have to be answered before Gondor could truly be united under any ruler, crowned or otherwise. The battle was won, but the war for Gondor's future had only just begun. Chapter 9. The House of Healing. The wound was not deep, but it was enough to send Boromir to the Houses of Healing in the aftermath of the great battle. A troll's blade had found the gap between his pauldron and breastplate during the final phase of the fighting, scoring a line across his shoulder that bled more freely than it threatened his life. But the healers insisted, and in truth, Boromir was grateful for the excuse to sit still for a time and process what had happened on the Pelennor fields. The houses of healing were busier than he had ever seen them, filled with the wounded from both sides of the conflict, though only the men of Gondor and Rohan were being tended here. The Orcs and Suthrons, who had survived the rout, would receive what mercy they could expect. But the priority was for those who had stood against the darkness. Boromir found himself in a long hall lined with beds, the air thick with the smell of medicinal herbs, and the low murmur of pain being endured with quiet courage. "My lord." The voice belonged to Ioreth, the eldest of the healing women, who had tended Boromir's wounds since he was a boy scraping his knees in the citadel's courtyards. "When they brought you in, I thought we had lost you again. You have been missed in these halls, my lord. Missed greatly." "I am not easily killed, it seems," Boromir replied with a tired smile, settling back against the pillows as she cleaned and bound his wound with practiced efficiency. "Though I have been testing that proposition rather thoroughly of late." "So I have heard," Ioreth said, her tone carrying the particular blend of fondness and exasperation that came from decades of dealing with warriors who took unnecessary risks. "And I have heard other things as well. Strange tales of kings and ancient lineages, of claims and counterclaims. What are we to make of such stories, my lord?" Before Boromir could answer, a commotion arose from the far end of the hall, where a cluster of healers and attendants had gathered around one of the beds. He could hear Ioreth's sharp intake of breath, could see the way her eyes widened with something that might have been awe or fear. "What is it?" he asked, though something in the quality of the disturbance suggested he already knew. "The king," Ioreth whispered, her voice barely audible. "They say the king has come to heal the wounded. They say he has the gift, the hands of the true king that can call the hurt back from death itself." Boromir felt something cold settle in his chest. He had heard the old stories, of course. Every child of Gondor knew the tales of the ancient kings who could heal with a touch, who carried in their blood the power to mend what seemed broken, beyond repair. But those were legends from the distant past, stories told to explain why the throne had remained empty for so long. No mortal man could actually possess such power. Could they? "Help me up," he said urgently, trying to swing his legs over the side of the bed, despite Ioreth's protests. "I must see this." "My lord, your wound." "My wound will keep. This will not." He made his way through the crowded hall, moving carefully through the press of people who had come to witness what was either miracle or fraud. At the center of the crowd, he could see Aragorn kneeling beside a bed where a figure lay still as death, pale and barely breathing. It took Boromir a moment to recognize his own brother. Faramir. The sight hit him like a physical blow. His brother, his younger sibling who had always been more scholar than warrior, more idealist than pragmatist, lying there with the grey pallor of one who was slipping away from the world of the living. Boromir had known that Faramir was wounded, had heard the reports of his desperate mission to Osgiliath, his near death from the Nazgul's assault, but seeing the reality of it was something else entirely. "How long has he been like this?" Boromir asked one of the healers, his voice rough with emotions he was struggling to contain. 3 days, my lord," the woman replied. "Since the Nazgul touched him with their cold. We have done all we can, but—" She shrugged helplessly. Some hurts go deeper than flesh and bone. This is not a wound that mortal healing can touch. But Aragorn was already placing his hands on Faramir's forehead, his fingers gentle as they traced patterns that seemed to follow the lines of some invisible current. As Boromir watched, the ranger's expression grew distant, focused on something beyond the immediate physical reality of the bedchamber. "Faramir," Aragorn said, his voice carrying an authority that seemed to resonate in the very air around them. "Son of Denethor, captain of Gondor, return. The darkness has passed. Your city stands. Your people are safe. Return to us." For a long moment, nothing happened. The assembled crowd held its collective breath, caught between hope and skepticism, waiting to see whether ancient legend would prove true or false. Then Faramir's eyelids fluttered, and colour began to return to his cheeks, like dawn creeping across a winter landscape. "My lord," Faramir whispered, his gaze focusing on Aragorn's face with the clarity of recognition. I dreamed I heard my king calling me back from a great darkness. Was it real?" "It was real," Aragorn replied gently, helping Faramir to sit up despite the protests of the healers. "You have been far from us, but you have returned. Rest now and heal." The effect on the watching crowd was electric. Boromir could hear gasps and whispers, could see faces transformed by wonder and dawning belief. These were people who had lived their entire lives hearing stories of the ancient kings, who had been raised on tales of the healing touch that marked true royalty. To see it demonstrated before their eyes was to witness the validation of every legend they had ever been told. But for Boromir, watching his brother's life restored by the touch of the man he had acknowledged as king, the significance went deeper than political validation or ancient prophecy. This was proof of legitimacy that no court could deny, no parliament could debate, no rival claimant could contest. This was the mark of divine authority, made manifest in the world of mortal men. "Boromir?" Faramir's voice was weak but clear, and his eyes found his brother's face in the crowd with the unerring accuracy of blood calling to blood. "Is it really you? They told me you were dead, that the horn was found broken. I live, brother," Boromir said, pushing through the crowd to kneel beside the bed. "I live, and I have learned much since we last spoke. Too much to explain in a single conversation." "The king," Faramir said, his gaze shifting between his brother and Aragorn. "Is it true? Is he really—" "He is," Boromir replied firmly. "He is the rightful king of Gondor, heir of Isildur, and I have sworn my loyalty to him. As should you, when you are strong enough to understand what that means." Faramir studied his brother's face with the careful attention of someone trying to reconcile the man before him with the brother he remembered. "You have changed," he said finally. "There is something different in your voice, your bearing. What happened to you out there?" "I learned the difference between serving my own vision of good and serving something greater than myself," Boromir replied. "I learned that pride can destroy even the best intentions, and that true strength sometimes means admitting when you are wrong." Before Faramir could respond, Aragorn was moving to the next bed, where Éowyn of Rohan lay in the same deathly stillness that had marked Faramir's condition. The White Lady had fought the Witch King himself, they said, and lived to tell of it, but the touch of the Nazgul Lord had left her hovering between life and death, lost in dreams too dark for waking minds to understand. Again, Aragorn placed his hands on the patient's forehead, and again spoke with the authority of kingship. "Éowyn, daughter of Éomund, Lady of Rohan, you have fulfilled your heart's desire. You have struck down the enemy's greatest servant, proven your courage beyond all doubt. Now lay down your sword and take up your life. The shadow is ended." And again, the healing worked its miracle. Éowyn's eyes opened, clear and bright, and she sat up with the fluid grace of someone whose strength had been fully restored. Around them, the witnesses murmured in awe and growing certainty. This was no trick or illusion, no political theatre designed to impress the credulous. This was the real thing, the ancient power of Númenórean kings made manifest in their darkest hour. The third healing, of Merry Brandybuck, was almost anticlimactic in its efficiency. The hobbit had been struck by the Black Captain's mace, his arm withered by the touch of evil, but under Aragorn's hands the damage was undone as if it had never been. Merry sat up with a grin that reminded Boromir powerfully of their journey together, their shared trials and triumphs. "Well," Merry said cheerfully, flexing his restored arm, "that's considerably better than it was an hour ago. Thank you, Your Majesty." Your Majesty. The title hung in the air like a bell that had been struck, and Boromir could see its effect on the faces around him. These people had witnessed the impossible, had seen their ancient legends validated by undeniable demonstration. There would be no more questions about legitimacy, no more debates about bloodlines or ancient claims. Aragorn had proven himself as surely as any king in the history of Gondor. Later, when the crowds had dispersed and the excitement had settled into quiet wonder, Boromir found himself sitting beside Faramir's bed in the gathering dusk. His brother was much improved, though still weak, and they had been talking for hours about everything that had happened since Boromir's departure for Rivendell. "I understand now why you support him," Faramir said quietly, his gaze fixed on the window where the lights of Minas Tirith were beginning to twinkle in the darkness. "It is not just the healing, though that would be proof enough for any rational mind. It is the way he carries himself, the way he speaks of duty and sacrifice. He does not want the crown, does he? He accepts it." "That may be the truest mark of a king," Boromir agreed. "The willingness to bear a burden rather than seize a prize. And father? How did he take the news of your return, of your allegiance?" Boromir was quiet for a long moment, remembering the pain in Denethor's eyes, the weight of disappointment and betrayal that had hung between them. "Not well," he said finally. "He sees it as abandonment, I think. The final proof that his vision of Gondor's future was always an illusion." "He will come around," Faramir said with the quiet confidence of someone who had always been their father's favorite. "He loves Gondor more than his own pride, when it comes to the test. And if this man can truly heal what seemed beyond healing, if he can restore what seemed lost forever, well, perhaps there is hope for reconciliation as well." "Perhaps," Boromir agreed, though he was not sure he shared his brother's optimism. Some wounds went deeper than flesh, deeper even than the touch of the Nazgul could reach. Some hurts required more than royal healing to mend. The next morning brought word that would test all their hopes and fears. Messengers had arrived from the Black Gate itself, bearing terms from the Dark Lord that were no terms at all. Surrender unconditionally, or watch every free people of Middle-earth be destroyed utterly. It was the final gambit, the last throw of dice in a game that had been building for centuries, and with it came the call for one last desperate assault, one final march into the very teeth of the enemy's power. "The council meets at midday," Aragorn said when he came to check on the wounded. "We must decide whether to answer this challenge, whether to stake everything on one last throw of the dice." "There is no choice to make," Boromir said, and his voice carried a certainty that surprised even him. "We cannot surrender. We cannot negotiate with evil. We can only march forward and trust that our cause is just. Even knowing that it is almost certainly suicide, Aragorn asked quietly. Especially knowing that, Boromir replied, because sometimes the greatest victories come from the willingness to sacrifice everything for what matters most. And if we must die, better to die standing than kneeling. Aragorn nodded slowly, and Boromir saw in his eyes the recognition of a man who had found not just political support, but genuine friendship and counsel. Whatever came next, they would face it together, not as rival claimants to authority, but as brothers in arms, united in service to something greater than either of their individual ambitions. The Houses of Healing had worked their deepest magic that day, healing wounds that went far deeper than flesh and bone. And perhaps, Boromir thought, as he watched the king prepare for what might be their final campaign, that was the truest miracle of all. Chapter 10. The Last Debate. The council chamber in the citadel had seen many desperate deliberations over the centuries, but perhaps never one quite so stark in its impossibility as this. Around the great table sat the leaders of the free peoples, Aragorn newly acknowledged as king, Prince Imrahil of Dol Amroth, Éomer king of Rohan, Gandalf the White, and others whose counsel had weight in matters of war and statecraft. At the table's foot sat the ultimatum from the Dark Lord, its black seal broken to reveal terms that were no terms at all. Surrender unconditionally, it read, or watch every free people of Middle-earth be destroyed utterly. There can be no question of accepting, Prince Imrahil said, his voice carrying the flat certainty of a man who had seen too much war to harbour illusions about enemy mercy. Whatever Sauron promises, his word is worth nothing. We have seen what happens to those who trust in his clemency. Nor can we simply ignore the ultimatum, Éomer added grimly. His armies are regrouping even now. Give him time to recover from the losses at the Pelennor, and he will return with forces we cannot hope to match. The next assault on Minas Tirith will be the last. Boromir listened to the exchange with the part of his mind that had been trained since childhood to assess military situations, to weigh strengths and weaknesses, to find advantage where none seemed to exist. The strategic situation was clear enough. They had won a single battle, but the war was far from over. Sauron's resources remained vast, his capacity to replace losses far greater than their own. In any conventional sense, the position was hopeless. But there was something else, something that conventional military thinking could not account for. The ring. Frodo and Sam, somewhere in the wastes of Mordor, carrying the one weapon that could end this war decisively. Everything else, all their strategies, all their sacrifices, all their desperate courage, was merely a distraction designed to keep Sauron's attention focused away from his own borders. We must give them time, Aragorn said quietly, and though he did not name the hobbits directly, everyone in the chamber understood his meaning. Whatever the cost to ourselves, we must ensure that the true mission has every chance of success. Time? Gandalf repeated, his ancient eyes fixed on something beyond the immediate confines of the chamber. Yes, time is what we must purchase, though the coin be our very lives. But how to buy that time? How to keep the eye turned outward when every instinct must be drawing it inward, toward the danger that approaches his very heart? It was then that Boromir spoke, his voice cutting through the uneasy silence that had settled over the council like fog. We march to the Black Gate, he said simply. We present ourselves before the Morannon, with what force we can muster, challenge the Dark Lord to single combat with all that we can bring against him, and fight the most hopeless battle in the history of Middle-earth. The silence that followed was profound, weighted with implications that every man present understood immediately. Several of the council members exchanged glances, that spoke of polite skepticism, of generals wondering if the strain of recent battles had affected Boromir's judgment. 7,000 men, Prince Imrahil said carefully, against the full might of Mordor, on ground of Sauron's choosing, with no hope of retreat or reinforcement. You speak of suicide, Lord Boromir, not strategy. I speak of necessity, Boromir replied, rising from his chair to move to the great map that dominated one wall of the chamber. His finger traced the route from Minas Tirith to the Black Gate, the path that would carry them into the very jaws of the enemy's power. Look at this from Sauron's perspective. He has just suffered a devastating defeat at our hands. His greatest captain destroyed, his finest troops scattered, his carefully prepared assault broken against our walls. He will be cautious now, reluctant to commit his remaining forces to another direct assault, until he understands how we achieved such an unexpected victory. He turned back to face the council, and his expression carried the quiet intensity of a man who had thought deeply about what he was proposing. But if we march to his very door, if we challenge him openly in sight of Barad-dûr itself, what will he think? That we have discovered some new weapon, some source of power that makes us confident of victory even against impossible odds. That we know something he does not. And that knowledge will compel him to respond, Gandalf said slowly, understanding dawning in his expression. He cannot ignore such a challenge, cannot risk that we truly have found some means to threaten him directly. He will commit everything to crushing us, to learning our secrets. Everything, Boromir agreed. Every orc, every troll, every Nazgul that remains to him. All focused on our little army, all turned away from his borders, all blind to the true danger that creeps ever closer to Mount Doom. Yoma leaned forward, his weathered features creased with thought. It is a plan born of desperation, he said. But then, desperate times call for desperate measures. The question is not whether we can survive such an assault. Clearly we cannot. The question is whether our sacrifice will serve its purpose. That depends on factors beyond our control, Aragorn said quietly. But it is the only chance we have, the only way to ensure that... He paused, unwilling to speak openly of Frodo's mission, even among trusted allies. The only way to ensure that other efforts have the time they need to reach fruition. The debate continued for hours, with every possible variation of the plan examined, every alternative strategy weighed and found wanting. But Boromir could see that the fundamental logic was sound, could see it settling into the minds of the other council members like a stone into still water. They could not win this war through conventional means. Their only hope lay in unconventional sacrifice, in the willingness to stake everything on a single, desperate gamble. I will lead the van, Boromir said, when the discussion had turned to matters of implementation. The men know me, trust my judgment in matters of war. If this plan is to succeed, they must believe in it completely, must march to their deaths with confidence in their cause. That requires leadership they recognize and respect. You will lead alongside me, Aragorn corrected gently. This is not a suicide mission for Gondor alone, but a joint effort of all free peoples. The men must see their king and their captain united in purpose, must understand that we ask nothing of them, that we are not willing to give ourselves. Later, when the council had dispersed, and the orders had been given for the army's preparation, Boromir found himself walking with Aragorn through the silent streets of the citadel. Above them, the stars wheeled in their ancient courses, indifferent to the struggles of mortal men, but somehow comforting in their eternal constancy. You know this is likely death for both of us, Aragorn said without preamble, Whatever our hopes for the mission's success, we will not live to see the outcome." "I know," Boromir replied, "and I find myself strangely at peace with that knowledge. For most of my life, I believed that the greatest service I could render Gondor was to preserve myself, to ensure that the line of stewards continued, that there would be someone to rule when the crisis passed. But I have learned that there are causes worth dying for, purposes that matter more than personal survival." "That is a hard lesson for any man to learn," Aragorn observed. "Harder still for one raised to believe that his duty was to endure, to outlast the darkness through sheer stubborn persistence." They walked in comfortable silence for a time, two men who had travelled far together, who had learned to trust each other through trial and hardship. When Boromir spoke again, his voice carried a reflective quality that spoke of thoughts long considered. "Do you remember what Gandalf said after Isengard? That my survival might be part of some larger design, some purpose that we could not yet see clearly?" "I remember. I think I understand now what he meant. I was not preserved so that I could return to Gondor as the heir to the stewardship, so that I could resume my old role and my old certainties. I was preserved so that I could be here, at this moment, adding my voice to this decision, so that when the history of this time is written, it cannot be said that Gondor's heir opposed the plan that saved Middle-earth." Aragorn stopped walking and turned to face his companion, studying his features in the starlight. "You believe that your support makes a difference to the outcome?" "I believe that it makes a difference to the people who must carry out the plan," Boromir replied. "The soldiers who will march to the Black Gate, the captains who must maintain discipline in the face of hopeless odds, the citizens who must understand why their leaders chose death over surrender. They need to see that all their leaders, from all backgrounds and traditions, are united in this purpose." "United," Aragorn repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, I think that may be the key to everything. Not just the army that marches to the Morannon, but the kingdom that must be rebuilt afterward. If we somehow survive this war, if the darkness is somehow lifted, Gondor will need leaders who have learned to work together, rather than against each other." "If we survive," Boromir said with a slight smile, "I suspect that will be the least of our challenges. But you are right. The kingdom that emerges from this war will need to be different from the one that entered it. Stronger, perhaps, because it has learned that true strength comes not from isolation, but from alliance." The days that followed passed in a blur of preparation and departure. 7,000 men, Gondorians, Rohirrim, men of the southern fiefs, gathered under the banners of the free peoples for what all understood would be their final march. Boromir found himself at the head of the column alongside Aragorn, his presence serving as a visible symbol of Gondor's commitment to the desperate plan. The men looked to both of them for leadership, but Boromir was surprised to discover how naturally the dual command had evolved. There was none of the tension or rivalry that might have been expected, none of the political maneuvering that had characterized so many of Gondor's military endeavors in the past. Instead, there was simply the shared understanding of two men who had learned to trust each other completely, who could communicate with a glance or gesture, who had merged their individual strengths into something greater than either could achieve alone. "It feels right," he told Aragorn as they made camp on the second night, with the mountains of shadow looming dark against the eastern sky. "This partnership, this shared responsibility. I spent so many years believing that leadership was about individual authority, about having the strength to bear burdens alone. But this feels like what command should be." "Perhaps that is another lesson we were meant to learn," Aragorn replied. that the hardest battles cannot be won by any single hero, no matter how brave or skilled. That victory comes from ordinary people choosing to trust each other, to fight together, to sacrifice together for something larger than themselves. As they approached the Morannon, as the black walls of the Black Gate rose before them like a manifestation of despair itself, Boromir felt no fear, no doubt about the choice they had made. This was where he was meant to be, not defending the White City from behind its walls, but standing in the open field before the gates of hell itself, daring the darkness to show its true face. He had become not just a supporter of Aragorn's claim, not just a political ally or military subordinate, but a true partner in leadership. And whatever the outcome of the battle that was to come, that partnership had already achieved something that neither of them could have accomplished alone: the unification of Gondor's future under a shared vision of service and sacrifice. The debate was over. The die was cast. All that remained was to see whether their desperate gamble would purchase the time that hope required. Chapter 11. The Black Gate opens. The Morannon stood before them like a monument to despair itself, its black towers reaching toward a sky that seemed permanently stained with shadow. Boromir had seen many fortifications in his years as a soldier, had studied the great defensive works of Gondor and her enemies, but nothing had prepared him for the sheer malevolent presence of Sauron's greatest gate. It was not merely a barrier of stone and iron, but a manifestation of will, the Dark Lord's determination to bar all light and hope from his domain. Before those gates, 7,000 men of the Free Peoples had arrayed themselves in defiance of every tactical principle Boromir had ever learned. They were outnumbered by odds so vast as to be almost meaningless. 10 to 1, 20 to 1, perhaps more. Their position offered no defensible ground, no possibility of retreat, no hope of reinforcement. By every measure of military science, they were already dead, and yet they stood in perfect formation, their banners snapping in the evil wind that blew from Mordor, their weapons bright in the sickly light that filtered through the pall of smoke above. They stood because their leaders had asked them to, because the cause was just, and because sometimes the greatest victories came not from tactical brilliance, but from the simple willingness to face impossible odds. "Remember," Aragorn said quietly, his voice carrying just to Boromir and the other commanders at the front of the host, "we do not fight for victory here. We fight for time, for hope, for the chance that others may succeed where we cannot. Whatever happens, whatever horrors they show us, we hold the line." Boromir nodded, his hand resting on the pommel of his sword. Around them, the captains repeated the king's words to their companies, and the message spread through the ranks like ripples in a still pond. Hold the line. Give them time. Trust that their sacrifice would serve a purpose beyond their understanding. It was then that the great gates began to open with a sound like the grinding of mountains, and from the darkness beyond emerged a figure that made even veteran warriors take an involuntary step backward. The mouth of Sauron sat his black horse with the casual arrogance of one who served absolute power, his helm concealing features that might once have been human, but had long since been twisted into something else entirely. Behind him came a small escort of orcs bearing a banner of truce, though the parley they offered was clearly intended as psychological warfare rather than genuine negotiation. The mouth's voice, when he spoke, carried across the assembled armies with unnatural clarity, each word falling like a stone into still water. "So the little king comes at last to kneel before his master," the herald said, his tone carrying mockery that was all the more effective for being delivered with perfect courtesy. "How long we have waited for this moment. how long the Dark Lord has desired to welcome the heir of Isildur home to his proper place. "I come not to kneel, but to stand," Aragorn replied, his voice carrying the quiet authority that Boromir had learned to recognize as one of his truest strengths. "I come to offer terms for the release of prisoners illegally taken, and for the withdrawal of your master's forces from the lands of free peoples." The mouth's laughter was like the sound of metal scraping against stone, harsh and discordant. "Terms? You speak of terms when you bring barely 7,000 men to stand against the accumulated might of Mordor? You speak of prisoners when you have no power to enforce any demand?" He gestured to one of his escorts, and the orc came forward, bearing a cloth bundle that he unwrapped with deliberate ceremony. From within, he drew forth items that made Boromir's blood run cold: an elven cloak, a sword of hobbit make, and most damning of all, a shirt of mithril mail so fine it seemed to shimmer with its own light. "Perhaps these will clarify the situation," the mouth continued, holding up the mithril shirt so that all could see it clearly. "Your little spies have been taken. They were captured in the passes of Cirith Ungol, overcome by forces they could not hope to match. One died fighting, as his kind do. The other—" The herald's pause was perfectly calculated for maximum effect. "The other lives still, though he may wish he did not before the questioning is done." The effect on the assembled army was immediate and devastating. Boromir could hear gasps and muttered curses, could see the way shoulders sagged and weapons drooped as men processed what they had just learned, the mission they had come to support, the desperate gamble that justified their own sacrifice, had failed. The ring-bearer was captured or dead, and with him died all hope of victory through any means save the might of arms. But it was Boromir's own reaction that surprised him most. Looking at that mithril shirt, Frodo's shirt, which he had seen the hobbit wearing through all their long journey from Rivendell, he felt not despair, but rage. Pure, white-hot fury at the thought of small, brave Frodo in the hands of torturers, of Sam dying alone in some dark pass, of everything they had sacrificed being perverted into a tool of enemy propaganda. "You lie," he said, his voice cutting across the herald's continuing taunts with the authority of absolute conviction. "Those are tokens, nothing more. Proof of battle, perhaps, but not of capture. You would not be here offering parley if your master's victory were truly complete." The mouth's attention fixed on him with uncomfortable intensity, as if seeing him clearly for the first time. And who speaks with such certainty? Who dares to call the servants of the Dark Lord liars? "I am Boromir, son of Denethor, Captain General of Gondor," Boromir replied, stepping forward so that he stood level with Aragorn. "And I have learned to recognize desperate theatre when I see it. If the ring were truly in your master's hands, you would not be here bargaining with us. You would be preparing our chains." The psychological battle that followed was as important as any clash of arms. The mouth continued his attempts to demoralize the army, painting vivid pictures of the fate awaiting those who defied the Dark Lord's will. But Boromir found himself countering each thrust with the skills he had learned not in military academies, but in the councils of Gondor, where words could be weapons as sharp as any blade. More importantly, he could see his words having effect on the men around him. Shoulders straightened, weapons rose, and the murmur of despair that had begun to spread through the ranks was replaced by something harder and more determined. They might die here, but they wouldn't die believing their cause was already lost. When the parley finally broke down, as everyone had known it would, when the herald wheeled his horse and rode back through the Morannon, with promises of torment and death, Boromir felt the familiar tightening in his chest that always preceded battle. But this time, it was different. There was no fear, no doubt about his role or purpose. There was only the calm certainty of a man who had found exactly where he belonged. The battle, when it came, was everything the most pessimistic strategist could have imagined, and worse. The gates vomited forth orcs in numbers that beggar description, trolls and fell beasts, Easterlings and Southrons, all the strength that Mordor could muster. They came in waves like a dark tide, seeking to overwhelm the small army of the Free Peoples through sheer weight of numbers. But the army held. It held because Aragorn commanded the center with the skill of a born tactician and the authority of a true king. It held because Éomer led the cavalry of Rohan in charge after devastating charge. It held because Prince Imrahil anchored the southern flank with the disciplined knights of Dol Amroth. And it held because Boromir commanded the northern wing with everything he had learned in a lifetime of warfare, everything he had gained from his months of transformation and growth. When orc chieftains tried to break his lines, he was there with sword in hand. When trolls threatened to shatter his formations, he was there with tactical adjustments that turned their strength against them. When despair began to creep into the hearts of his men, he was there with words of encouragement and the visible proof that their leaders would not ask them to face anything they were not willing to face themselves. "Hold fast!" he shouted over the din of battle, his voice somehow carrying to men who needed to hear it most. "Remember why we stand here. Remember what we protect." Hours passed, or perhaps minutes. Time lost all meaning in the chaos of desperate combat. Boromir's sword arm ached with fatigue. His armor was dented and stained with the black blood of orcs, and he could see that the enemy was beginning to press forward despite all their efforts. The army was giving ground, step by step, compressed into an ever smaller circle as the vast host of Mordor sought to overwhelm them through sheer persistence. It was then that something changed in the quality of the air itself. Boromir felt it before he saw it. A sudden lightening, as if a great weight had been lifted from the world. The orcs around him paused in their assault, their crude features twisted with confusion and something that might have been fear. In the distance, toward the heart of Mordor, he could see a pillar of fire rising into the sky, and with it came a sound like the cry of all the world's pain given voice. Then the enemy's forces simply collapsed. It happened so quickly that it was difficult to process. One moment, the army of the Free Peoples was surrounded and outnumbered beyond hope. The next, their enemies were fleeing in panic, casting aside weapons and banners as they ran. The great war trolls stumbled and fell as if their strings had been cut. The Nazgûl, wheeling overhead on their fell beasts, suddenly screamed in agony and were swept away on a wind that seemed to blow from the ending of the world. "The ring," Aragorn said, his voice filled with wonder and something approaching disbelief. "The ring is destroyed. Frodo has succeeded." Boromir lowered his sword and looked around at the battlefield that had been transformed in an instant from a scene of desperate last stands to one of impossible victory. Around him, men were cheering and weeping and embracing each other with the fierce joy of those who had faced certain death and found life instead. But his own reaction was quieter, more internal. He thought of small Frodo, carrying that terrible burden through darkness and despair to its ultimate destination. He thought of Sam, loyal beyond all reason, who had surely been there at the end, as he had been through all the long journey. He thought of Merry and Pippin, whose courage had helped make this moment possible. He thought of Gandalf, whose wisdom had guided them all. He thought of Legolas and Gimli and Aragorn, whose friendship had taught him what fellowship truly meant. Most of all, he thought of the man he had been when this journey began. Proud, certain of his own righteousness, convinced that strength and will could solve any problem. That man would not have understood this victory, would have seen it as luck or chance rather than the inevitable result of ordinary people choosing to trust each other, to sacrifice for each other, to believe in something larger than their own survival. "We held the line," he said quietly, and the words carried more satisfaction than any victory cry could have conveyed. We held the line, and we gave them time. As the army began the long process of regrouping and caring for the wounded, as messengers were sent to carry word of the victory to every corner of Middle-earth, Boromir found himself thinking not of the glory that would surely follow, not of the rewards and recognition that awaited the heroes of this day, but of the simple fact that he had been trusted with a role in the greatest story ever told. He had been redeemed not through grand gestures or noble speeches, but through the quiet willingness to stand where he was needed, to fight for something beyond his own comfort or pride, to trust in purposes larger than his own understanding. It was a kind of victory that no defeat could ever take away. Chapter 12. The Return of the King. The great court of the citadel had seen many ceremonies in its long history, but perhaps none quite so charged with significance as this. Lords and ladies from every corner of Gondor and beyond had gathered to witness what had seemed impossible only months before: the restoration of the kingship, the return of Isildur's heir to the throne that had stood empty for nearly 1,000 years. Boromir stood at the front of the assembled nobility, wearing the formal robes of the stewardship that felt strange after so many months in travel-stained clothing and battle gear. Around him, he could see faces that reflected the same mixture of hope, uncertainty, and cautious optimism that he felt stirring in his own chest. The old order was ending today, and a new one beginning, and none of them could be certain what that would mean for their ancient kingdom. At the center of it all stood Aragorn, no longer the Ranger of the North, no longer even the chieftain of the Dunedain, but Elessar, king of Gondor, and Arnor, heir of Isildur, restored to the throne of his fathers. The crown that Gandalf placed upon his head was ancient beyond memory, its mithril bright in the morning sun, its jewels catching the light like captured stars. When the formal words had been spoken, when the oaths had been given and received, when the great bell of the citadel had rung out across Minas Tirith to announce the dawn of the Fourth Age, it was Boromir who stepped forward first to kneel before his king. "Elessar," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the silent court. "I, Boromir son of Denethor, heir of the stewards, offer you my fealty and service. I acknowledge you as the rightful king of Gondor, and I pledge to you my sword, my counsel, and my loyalty, for as long as I draw breath." The words were formal, prescribed by ceremony and tradition, but Boromir invested them with something deeper, the weight of genuine conviction, the product of a transformation that had cost him everything he thought he knew about duty and honor, and turned it into something truer and more enduring. Aragorn, Elessar, received his oath with the dignity befitting a king, but when he spoke the traditional response, Boromir could hear in his voice the warmth of friendship that would always exist between them, alongside the formal bonds of sovereignty. "Rise, Lord Boromir," the king said, "and take your place as my chief counselor and friend. Let all know that the House of Hurin serves still, not as rulers in their own right, but as the most trusted advisors to the throne, as they have been since the kingdom's founding." The ceremony that followed was a blur of formal presentations, diplomatic protocols, and ceremonial exchanges that would establish the new order's relationship with every ally and neighbor. But Boromir found his attention drawn repeatedly to one figure in the crowd, his father, Denethor, standing with the other lords of Gondor, but somehow apart from them, his expression unreadable as he watched his son publicly acknowledge the end of the stewardship's long rule. Later, when the formal celebrations had moved to the great hall and the court had dispersed into smaller groups of conversation and political maneuvering, Boromir found himself walking with his father through the quiet gardens of the citadel. The sun was setting over the Pelennor fields, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to promise better days ahead. "It is done, then," Denethor said, after they had walked in silence for some time. "The stewardship ends, and the kingship is restored. 1,000 years of service, concluded with ceremony and fine words." There was no bitterness in his voice, which surprised Boromir more than anger would have. Instead, there was a kind of weary acceptance, the tone of a man who had fought against inevitability for as long as possible and finally recognized the futility of further resistance. "The stewardship does not end," Boromir replied carefully. "It transforms. We serve still, father, but as counselors rather than rulers, as advisors rather than sovereigns." Denethor stopped walking and turned to study his son's face in the fading light. "You truly believe that, don't you? You truly believe that this change serves Gondor's interests, rather than merely satisfying ancient claims and romantic notions?" "I have seen his authority acknowledged by powers greater than any mortal court," Boromir said. "I have watched him heal wounds that seemed beyond all healing, command loyalty from the dead themselves, inspire hope in the darkest hour. He is what he claims to be, and Gondor needs a king more than she needs the continuation of familiar traditions." "And what of you?" Denethor asked quietly. "What becomes of Boromir, son of Denethor, who was raised to inherit the burden of rule? What becomes of the man who was meant to be the 27th ruling steward of Gondor?" It was a question that Boromir had been asking himself for months, ever since that morning at Amon Hen, when he should have died, but did not, when he made the choice to pursue his companions rather than return immediately to Minas Tirith. The answer had come to him gradually, through trial and loss, and the slow accumulation of wisdom. "He becomes something better," Boromir said simply. "He becomes a man who serves not because it is his birthright, but because it is his choice. He becomes a counselor rather than a ruler, a friend rather than a superior, a supporter rather than a rival. He becomes what he should have been all along, if he had been wise enough to see it." They walked on through the gardens as the stars began to emerge in the darkening sky, father and son finding a peace that had eluded them since Boromir's return. There was still pain there, still the sense of loss that came with the end of an age. But there was also something like relief, the recognition that burdens long carried could finally be set down. "I was wrong about him," Denethor admitted, after a time. "I saw only a pretender seeking to displace legitimate authority. I did not see a king returning to claim his proper place. My pride blinded me to possibilities that my son could see clearly." "Your pride was not without cause," Boromir replied gently. "The stewards have been Gondor's salvation for centuries. Without you, without our family's service, the kingdom would have fallen long before any king could return to claim it. That service has meaning that no restoration can diminish." "Perhaps," Denethor said, "but I think the age of the stewards is truly ended now. The age of the king has begun, and we must learn to find our place in it." The days that followed were filled with the complex work of transition, of establishing how the restored monarchy would function after so many centuries of stewardly rule. Boromir found himself at the center of these negotiations, serving as a bridge between the old order and the new, helping to shape institutions that would preserve the best of Gondor's traditions while adapting to the reality of royal authority. It was demanding work, requiring all the political skills he had learned in his father's court, combined with the wisdom he had gained through his travels and transformation. But it was also deeply satisfying in ways that his old role as heir to the stewardship had never been. He was building something new rather than merely maintaining something old, creating rather than preserving, and the difference felt profound. "You have found your calling," Gandalf observed one evening, when they met to discuss the establishment of the new council structure. "I told you once that your survival might serve purposes we could not yet see clearly. I think those purposes are becoming visible now." "I think you are right," Boromir agreed, "though I suspect the purposes were different from what any of us might have expected. I was not preserved to resume my old role, but to help create a new one." "The role of the wise counselor," Gandalf said with approval, "the advisor who serves not from duty, but from choice, not from inheritance, but from merit. It is a role that Gondor has needed for a long time, though she may not have realized it." Weeks passed, then months, as the new order settled into its rhythms and the kingdom adapted to the reality of royal rule. Boromir found himself busier than he had ever been as heir to the stewardship, consulted on everything from military reorganization to trade negotiations to the delicate work of integrating the various peoples of the restored realm. But the work felt different now, purposeful in ways that his old duties had not. He was not simply maintaining existing systems, but helping to build better ones, not just preserving ancient privileges, but creating new opportunities for service and advancement. Most importantly, he was doing it all as part of a partnership, rather than as a solitary burden-bearer, working alongside a king who valued his counsel and trusted his judgment. "Do you ever regret it?" Elisar asked him one day, as they walked the walls of Minas Tirith, looking out over a city that was slowly recovering from the damages of war. "Do you ever wish you had died at Amon Hen, as you were meant to? That you had been spared the complexity of living through all these changes?" Boromir considered the question seriously, thinking of the man he had been when he set out for Rivendell. Proud, certain, convinced that he understood his place in the world and his duty to his people. That man would indeed have found the current situation difficult to accept, would have struggled with the loss of ancient prerogatives and the need to serve rather than rule. But he was not that man any longer. "I think," he said slowly, "that dying at Amon Hen would have been the easier path. It would have preserved my pride, secured my reputation, and allowed me to escape the consequences of my actions through a noble sacrifice. But I also think it would have been the lesser choice." "How so?" "Because redemption, true redemption, is not about escaping consequences, but about living with them, learning from them, allowing them to transform you into something better than what you were. I failed at Amon Hen, fell to temptation, and betrayed the trust of someone who deserved better from me. Dying for my failure would have been dramatic, but living with it, growing beyond it, finding ways to serve despite it, that required something deeper than heroism." He paused, watching the sun set over the Pelennor fields, where so many had died for the cause they now served together. "I was raised to believe that the greatest service I could render Gondor was to preserve myself, to ensure continuity of leadership, to embody the strength and persistence that had carried our people through dark times. But I have learned that there are different kinds of service, different ways of serving something larger than oneself." "And which way do you choose now?" Boromir smiled, feeling a contentment that had nothing to do with personal ambition and everything to do with purpose, rightly understood. I choose to serve as a counselor rather than a ruler, as a partner rather than a superior, as a friend rather than a sovereign. I choose to help build something new rather than merely preserve something old. I choose to trust in purposes larger than my own understanding, and to find my meaning in service rather than authority. As the stars emerged in the darkening sky above Minas Tirith, as the lights of the White City began to twinkle in the gathering dusk, Boromir felt the deep satisfaction of a man who had found his proper place in the world. He was no longer the heir to the stewardship, no longer the proud warrior who had sought to claim the ring for what he believed were righteous purposes. He was something simpler and truer, a man who had learned the difference between serving his own vision of good and serving something genuinely greater than himself, a counselor who offered wisdom rather than commands, a friend who supported rather than competed, a servant who had found freedom in the recognition that his greatest strength lay not in authority, but in humility. The transformation was complete, and the man who emerged from it was far more than the sum of what he had lost. He had traded the burden of rule for the joy of service, the isolation of command for the warmth of partnership, and the pride of inheritance for the deeper satisfaction of choice. It was, he realized as he stood on the walls of the city, he would spend his life serving, exactly what he had always been meant to become.